Okay. Hello, everybody. Let me just wait for everyone to join in. And while we're waiting, I will real quick post the tasty link. Let me just fire this off. Alrighty. I think they're doing a latency thingy. It always takes a few seconds before anybody shows up. But also, I can't help but notice I'm streaming at exactly the same time as Critical Role. What was I thinking? Oh no. Hey everybody, how's it going? Oh boy, alright. Well, the chat's already firing off like fireworks, but the view count hasn't yet updated. We'll figure it out. Oy vey. Alright, let's see. So, I came into this solo stream with an honest-to-God plan. A plan that you guys voted for on Twitter. Oh no, am I quiet? Uh-oh, hold on. Let me just, crank my gain. Indigo's not in chat to my knowledge, but I'm sure I'm making her proud. Alright, is that better? Looks better. I think I'm in about the yellow zone when I talk. Oh boy, anyway, yeah, so I came into this with an actual plan. I proposed different options on Twitter, and people voted. And for a while there, it looked like freeform nonsense was genuinely going to win, like just doing the last time I did a solo stream, but again, which is nuts to me, and truly hilarious. Like, wow. I can't believe that went as well as it did, all things considered. It's like, oh yeah, just put me unsupervised on a stream for 3 hours. And apparently I'll just talk about all the show stuff that I normally can't talk about. Shocker. Anyway, who is messaging? Ah, we're good. In my defense, I gave the cool colors fair warning. It's not my fault that they're all busy and haven't seen my messages yet. So this'll be fun. Anyway, yes, so the alleged plan for this stream, as you can see from my handy-dandy text box, is a Trope Talk lightning round. So basically, last time what ended up happening is, you guys would, like, basically be like, hey, what did you think of this show? And I'd be like, oh my god, I have so many thoughts on that show. And then I'd just go off on it for, like, 10 minutes. And I was thinking this time we could get a smidge of like, coherency, cohesion, whatever. Consistency, one of those con words. Basically, the gist being, we talk about tropes that are maybe, like, too small or too specific to necessarily be able to have, like, full trope talks about them, because, of course, a lot of, there are a lot of tropes that are just, like, really, really, like, narrow, and it doesn't, really warrant a full script, or there's not really much to say about it after a certain point. Where are all these toadstools coming from? You guys are just really getting wild with the emojis today. Let's see. Anyway, yeah, so the gist is that rather than suggesting, like, shows, you guys can, in the chat, be like, hey, what do you think about this trope? And I'll be like, oh man, I have so many thoughts on that trope, or possibly not. This narrowly won out over more freeform nonsense, which I can't believe. Hang on, how many of you guys voted for that? It was like almost 1,000 votes total, 29% to freeform nonsense. About 290 people were like, yeah, I want to see more of that again. Ay, ay, ay. Okay, let's see. Well, I guess it's a step up from just potatoes. Ooh, small town with a dark secret trope. That's a fun one. Very specific, not really something that you can go full trope talk on unless you, like, really kind of read into it farther than it necessarily deserves. Like, you could talk about, like, insular communities and a certain amount of, like, how humans have, like, in-groups and out-groups and often mistrust the out-group automatically, and especially in smaller, more insular communities, that can be worse. So small towns with dark secrets almost just feel like a logical extension of that. It's like you have a character who, they come to a space that they're not familiar with. They're kind of, new there. They don't really know the terrain. Nobody there knows them. They don't know anybody there. And then it turns out that also everyone in this location is, like, unified by some weirdness that character doesn't understand. Which, if you take the Lovecraft angle is just garden variety xenophobia, but sometimes it's also like they're fish cultists or something like that. I don't know. You know, all kinds of stuff can happen. Oh boy. Trope. Daddy's little villain. A trope talk I won't make just because of how many times I'd have to say daddy in it. For those of you who don't know, the gist of that one is it's like when you have the villain, and the villain has like a kid, typically a daughter, who like they absolutely dote on, and the kid is also a villain. So it's like the spoiled kid of a villain who is themselves also a villain. As far as tropes go, it's not that deep. They tend to there's a bad guy in Teen Titans who is exactly that. I don't remember her name. I think her dad is Killer Moth. But that she's like the platonic ideal of this trope. It's like you're the spoiled kid of a villain, and it's one of those rare cases actually where the villain gets to have a loved one, which is actually pretty unusual for bad guys. Like it usually ends up kind of, you know, undercutting their villainy if you give a villain a loved one, especially a kid. But if the kid is spoiled rotten, that kind of makes it okay. You know, that sort of gives you a chance to make it so that the villain does not seem like a more humanized, better person because of how much they're doting on this person. Because oh, it's Kitten. Yeah, that's right. Her name's Kitten. Thanks, guys. Yes, absolutely. Kitten's the perfect name for that. Oh, what a weird episode. Oh, let's see. Oh, I gotta stop doing that. Someone in the comments on the last one pointed out that I click my tongue a lot, and I was like, I never do this when I have a script, but when I don't have a script, I gotta fill the space somehow. Azula is an interesting case. I don't know if she's quite a daddy's little villain. I feel like she kind of is, except for the fact that Ozai doesn't really do a good enough job parenting to really feel like he deserves that title, you know? Like, he's terrible. He's the worst. He doesn't actually support her or her needs or anything like that. So he definitely, you know, he's using her. He thinks she's a great second in command. But as soon as it looks like he's about to win, he's like, all right, I'm going to make you Fire Lord, and then I'm going to crown myself super cool God Emperor of the entire universe. But you can totally still have this chunk of the Fire Nation. All right, bye, sweetie. And it's like, okay, this is not like supportive villainous parenting. Okay, let's see. Yeah, Azula doesn't really get doted. She gets sent off to beat up her brother. It's not quite the same thing. Jinx. Why are we talking about Jinx? Is she, I mean, I remember her in Teen Titans. I just don't think she's quite a daddy's little villain. Is her dad a character? I don't remember that. Hang on, my poor computer fan is spinning up. Let me, close out some stoof. There we go. Anyway. Oh, there I go again. Okay, let's see. Mad Scientists. Oh my god. That is such a... That might be worth an actual trope talk, to be honest. It's like... Oh, Blue's back online. Perfect. All right. Anyway, what was I talking about? Mad Scientists, right. As far as tropes go, it's such a, like, specific and yet broad one. Because it's like, what's the gist? Okay, you're a scientist and you're maybe not fully clicked in with reality, as it were. Oh, wait, Arcane Jinx. That makes so much more sense. Sorry. Obviously. We were talking about Teen Titans. There's a character named Jinx in Teen Titans. You can see how I got confused. Anyway, yes, Arcane Jinx is absolutely a daddy's little villain, and it's fantastic, and also really sad. Anyway, Mad Scientists, right. It's like, I mean, obviously Victor Frankenstein is the example, and the trope is probably as popular as it is strictly because Frankenstein was such a darn good book. You know, that's often how it works. You know, you get like one really iconic example of a trope, and then just everybody's like, oh man, that's great. I gotta take that and put it in there. So, you know, example, Victor Frankenstein, he's, you know, he's doing immoral science. Let's not call it mad, but it is detrimental to his mental health. So in the most basic sense, it is mad science. But the version of Victor Frankenstein that everybody remembers is the one that kind of got codified in, like, the movies, where he's, you know, this actual scientist, like a doctor, and he's got a castle and like lightning rods and stuff and like a henchman and stuff like that. And, you know, regular like book Victor Frankenstein is far too broke to afford a henchman, and also a college student until he drops out. So, you know, the mad scientist trope, it's kind of built on itself. Like it sort of got codified as like a first draft as the actual book version of Victor Frankenstein, and then the movie version kind of became the example that everybody was following. And now mad scientist's like a whole spectrum. And I wonder if it's because of superheroes, honestly, because mad scientists are such easy bad guys. Like, I mean, on some level, almost all supervillains are kind of mad scientists, except for the ones that are like the rare evil Superman types that are like, I'm fully born with my abilities and I'm a jerk. But like most of them are like, oh, I build my superpowers, or I gave myself my superpowers in a lab accident, or I use my superpowers to do evil, heinous experiments or whatever. Also, if you like mad scientists, I have 2 webcomic recommendations. One of them is Girl Genius, which has been running for about as long as I've been alive. And one of them is The Glass Scientist, which I only got into recently. I read through the whole backlog. I finally got whacked with karma. I felt the way that a lot of people who read my comic feel, because I got through the backlog and I was like, no, where's the rest of it? So anyway, mad scientists are very fun. And if you like them, and you like when they're not just evil 2D bad guys, they're the main characters of both Girl Genius and The Glass Scientist are mad scientists. All right, whoever's in chat spamming individual letters, what are you doing, man? All right. Anyway. Sorry, had to time somebody out. Okay, what are we doing? Human weapons. I've seen that one come up a couple times. That one's actually a very meaty trope. That might be worth an actual video too. I'm gonna be like rewatching this video for timestamps and like taking notes. I'm like, oh, I should do a video about this properly. The human weapon trope basically is when you have a character who is a living person with autonomy and like thoughts and feelings and dreams of their own, but through someone else's intervention, they are basically being used or designed to be a living weapon, as in they are designed to just like be very good at doing a specific sort of damage, and like most weapons, they are designed to only do what the wielder wants them to do. Which, if it's a person with autonomy and thoughts and feelings and stuff, that's bad. That is a bad thing. And so human weapon tropes are almost always like, you get characters like X-23, where it's like, we're going to take a kid, and then we're going to sculpt her into a living weapon. And everyone's like, is this evil? Are we, like, evil for doing this? And the answer is yes. Shocker. In a lot of those stories, the human weapon is, like, through some means, they are justified as being in some way less than human or dehumanized in general. So you get characters that are like clones, X-23. You get characters that are like robots, in which case it's like, are they human? Well, if they have thoughts and feelings, functionally, yes. The gist of those stories is essentially humanization versus dehumanization, you know, and sometimes the living weapon it needs some work to kind of get them to acknowledge that they themselves are not, in fact, just a weapon, that they're allowed to have thoughts and feelings and stuff. This is why everybody should watch X-Men Evolution. It's invented X-23. It has the best version of X-23, and Wolverine's in peak dad mode in the X-23 episodes. It's flawless. Anyway, Flanderization I've seen pop up a few times. So Flanderization, for those of you who aren't familiar, because it's a pretty obscure term, or at least a weird one, is when a character, they have a weird quirk on top of like all their other quirks, but over time that one weird quirk just kind of grows to eclipse their entire personality. So it's like, oh, this character has a favorite food, and by the end of like season 6, their favorite food is the only thing they ever talk about. It's essentially a way for a character to be boiled down to their most basic, typically comedic core, like the easiest punchline you can associate with them. And it's generally, I don't necessarily know if it's a sign of lazy writing, but I think it's often a sign that like the writers, I don't know, maybe it's that they're prioritizing the punchline over the character's integrity, because you end up in a situation where the character, you know, their thoughts, feelings, hopes, dreams, etc., it all kind of gets just lost in favor of, hey, you know what would be really funny? If this person loved waffles. Let's see. Villain protagonist. Oh, wait. Has that popped up a lot, or is that just one person spamming? Don't do that. I'll be cranky. Okay, I see 2 of you. All right. So the villain protagonist trope is when you have the protagonist of a story who is a full-blown villain. Now, most people know at this point that protagonist and hero are not synonyms. Protagonist is the main character, the focus of the story. Hero is a moral judgment. It's like, okay, if you're a hero, you do heroic things in heroic ways. Which means you can have a protagonist who's not a good person. You can have a protagonist who isn't a hero, who is instead perhaps a villain. That's, that's your situations like, Death Note is kind of the easiest example that most people nowadays are familiar with, where it's like, this is the main character, he sucks real bad. God, that show is so funny. It's like, wow. Within 2 days, Elle was like, I know exactly who Kira is, and I can probably prove it in a week. It's like, wow. Light really is a genius, isn't he? What I love about that, not to completely digress into just my favorite example of this, but what I love about that is we spend so much time in Light's head as he's like, yes, I'm a genius. I'm the god of this new world. I'm going to totally run circles around the police as I remake the world in my image. And then we cut over to Elle, who's like, I've narrowed down that Light lives on this city block and is probably this guy's son because we played a TV program on the one station that we were beaming directly into that house, and then Light killed somebody, so it's got to be that guy. And it's like, wow, Light really thinks he's a genius. And then we just pop over to Elle, who's like, child's play. Anyway, that's an interesting show in how it writes smart characters. But that's not what the question was. Anyway, villain protagonists are interesting because sometimes, I'm a big fan of classic heroes. I'm a big fan of heroes I can just uncritically root for. And it's like, yeah, this is a good person. I want to see them do good things. But sometimes it's really fun to watch somebody, crash and burn spectacularly. I think this is 50% of the appeal of anybody who likes watching Vegeta do anything, especially early on. I understand he's gotten more heroified lately, but especially early on, it's just so funny to watch him because he's just hubris all the way up to here. And then the minute anything goes wrong, he's like, no, this can't be happening. I'm the legendary Super Saiyan. It's just incredible. Every time, someone with that much of an ego, you just love to watch fall apart. And villain protagonists are fantastic for that. Obviously, that's kind of how Death Note ends. The movie version of Chicago, which is the only one I've seen, kind of does the same thing, where it's you got this main cast composed almost entirely of horrible people, and they all sort of spend the movie tearing each other down and putting on a show, and it looks like they're going to win, and then at the end it's like, hey, that's showbiz, kiddo. It doesn't work out like that. And by the end, it's just such a catastrophic failure in everything, and it's yeah, that's what these guys deserve, and that's really fun. So, villain protagonists are usually fun to watch fail, whereas hero protagonists are typically fun to watch succeed and root for their victory. Villain protagonists, they often win early on, and then you're rooting for them to fall apart in a very satisfying way. It's kind of, unsurprisingly, it's sort of an inversion of the structure. Oh, I'm sorry for spoiling Death Note, an anime that's 20 years old at this point? How old is Death Note? I have no idea. Prophecies. Didn't I already do a video on Prophecies? I feel like I did. Maybe it was just looped in with the Chosen One video all those years ago. Anyway, Prophecies are fun if you do them right. A lot of the time they can be kind of not fun. It's a delicate balance to strike. Our detailed diatribe on the Super Saiyan thing as kind of this is a really good prophecy. Why? Because it kind of doesn't do anything a normal prophecy does. This is how it works a lot of the time. Sometimes a prophecy is just you don't need to worry. This is exactly how the story's going to go from now on. It's okay, cool. Then you go from there and it's well, there's really no suspense because I know that only one of these jokers is going to die and it's probably the guy who just got introduced. Anyway, no killing policy. Yeah, that's an interesting one. It's a pretty standard character trait for heroes to have, because in general, it's agreed on that killing people is bad, But, it's a bit flexible. You get characters where it's in character for them to be okay with doing the occasional minion murder. And then you get settings that don't seem to recognize that maybe it's a little bit weird to have your plucky teen heroes running around massacring sentient beings just because they're goblins or whatever. That's a thing that a lot of fantasy stories run into, and like correspondingly sci-fi, which is basically just fantasy but with a different flavor. When you have whole evil races, just, you know, entire peoples that are 100% evil cannon fodder that your characters can just mow down without mercy. And this can range from like, that's a little weird, that's clearly a whole thinking person with like a culture and stuff, to well, it's a robot, is it like really sentient? And then sometimes it's like, oh, it's absolutely sentient, this is kind of weird actually. So there's actually another webcomic recommendation, one that explores sort of the idea of cannon fodder races and the idea that like some of these guys are just okay to murder, is Daughter of the Lilies, which is currently on like a year-long hiatus because I believe the creator has like a storyboarding job and can't work on anything else in the meantime because of like legal reasons. But basically well, I don't want to spoil it, but even from the beginning you can kind of tell that this is a webcomic that is exploring the idea of what it means for a fantasy world to have like, yes, these people are people, but these people, oh, those are monsters. You can slaughter them indiscriminately and it's no skin off your nose. And especially in those universes where like, you know, the heroes have been mowing down goblins and orcs or whatever by the hundreds, and then they get to the final boss and they have the opportunity to kill him, and then they're like, no, I'm not like you. That would make me just as bad. And it's like, wow, bud. I think the decimated population of goblins already think you're probably that bad. Yes, person in chat, one of the sub names of this trope is always chaotic evil, which is based on a thing that was true in D&D 3.5. I feel like they've deprecated it for the recent editions, but when I was initially getting into D&D, you'd read through the monster manual and they would have like races that were basically, you know, humanoid. Everyone had an entry in the monster manual, even humans and elves and dwarves and stuff. And what that meant is that you would get entries that were like for, you know, black dragons and dark elves and Svirfniblin and stuff like that. And you're reading through it and you're like, oh, okay, they've got like a little line that says alignment. And some of them would be like any alignment. So like humans, any alignment. I think elves, it was like usually chaotic good, something like that. But there were some that would be always chaotic evil or always lawful evil. And dragons especially, like chromatic dragons and metallic dragons, had like always this alignment, which was a little hard to reconcile with the fact that they were all sentient beings and thus presumably capable of free will. So it'd be like, oh, all black dragons are chaotic evil, all is it chaotic? I don't remember, whatever. Like all gold dragons are lawful good, stuff like that. And as early as probably AD&D, people were kind of playing with that because one of the first iconic D&D characters was Drizzt Do'Urden, a drow, but he wasn't like other drow. It's been ages, but I actually read a bunch of those books at one point. So funny. The gist of this character, you've definitely either heard of this character or you've seen a character parodying this character. Drizzt was a drow, a dark elf ranger, and he had leather armor and 2 swords and like a panther best friend, I think. And his whole gist is that he was like a good guy drow from an evil matriarchal society. Parts of that series have aged ridiculously weirdly. But anyway, he emerges on the surface because he decides he doesn't want to be like with the other drow because they're all jerks. And then he comes out and like tries to help people, but everyone hates and fears him because, oh, he's a dark elf and they're always chaotic evil or lawful evil or one of those things. I don't remember. And so it's just like endless angst of just this guy being like, I have a good heart and I'm trying to help people, but they all hate and fear me due to the color of my skin. And it's like, whoa, careful, D&D, you almost made a point there. Anyway, Drizzt is very funny. Not intentionally, but there's a reason that he kind of like sparked off so many imitators because it's like, he's really like baby's first D&D character, you know? Anyway, so yeah, the idea that like whole peoples would have certain alignments was very popular, in part because of Tolkien. It came from Tolkien initially, and then they kind of just like played with it, and you know, it happens a lot. And the thing is, Tolkien kind of went out of his way to explain it, and even then it wasn't great. It's like, okay, well, you've got the orcs, and they're like corrupted elves or something like that, and they're like created by evil magic. And then you got the goblins, which are just all evil. Okay, cool. And it's like, oh, you've got these humans. They're also evil. Thank you, Tolkien. Anyway, my point is, like, early D&D didn't make this up. They got it from Lord of the Rings. And Anyway, yeah, so I'm always suspicious of that. And I think that when in doubt, I tend to go with, like, characters with no kill policies, or at least characters that are reluctant to kill, because I'm always very wary when characters that are supposed to be, like, plucky, innocent, good-hearted heroes just seem real casual about murdering certain people. It almost feels like a blind spot on the writer's part if it doesn't get acknowledged as a blind spot on the character's part. Anyway, let's see. I've seen blue and orange morality pop up a couple times. So the gist there is essentially, so the idea is that, there's a form of morality that is black and white morality, aka, evil versus good. So black and white morality, things are either evil or they are good. Blue and orange morality, is essentially that this is a being that has a binary moral system, but it's completely out of alignment with what we consider to be a binary moral system of good and evil. So essentially, you might have something that's like a fae or an alien creature, and essentially, instead of working on these things are evil and these things are good, and presumably you want to do good things and avoid evil things, or vice versa if you're purposefully villainous, they've got some other completely alien paradigm, like, I guess an early example of that, even if it's not that blue and orange, is Michael Moorcock's Eternal Champions series introduced the concept, well, I don't want to say introduced, I'm sure this concept pre-existed, but kind of put into the fantasy cultural zeitgeist the idea that law versus chaos was the eternal battle going on behind the universe. You had, like, Lords of Order, and you had chaos. And if this sounds familiar, it's because Warhammer ripped it wholesale. And even up to and including the symbol of chaos that he used in his books. It was great. So essentially, these are beings that don't care about good and evil, because all they care about is chaos versus order. That's the whole thing that they deal with. So it's like, okay, a being of chaos will choose to do the chaotic thing, not the good or evil thing. A being of order will choose to do the orderly thing, regardless of good or evil. And it's easy to be like, oh, chaos, evil, order, good. But in practical circumstances, that's not really how it works. Something can be completely orderly and very awful, and something can be completely chaotic and very, like, free and nice and chill. So, blue and orange morality sometimes gets more complicated than that, but it's a little bit complicated because it's difficult for writers to conceive of sometimes. It's like, sometimes you get, like, fae characters that usually the closest thing they have to a moral compass is how much fun they can have at any given time, which is, I think, at this point, like, the fairy trope. It's like, this fairy's strictly out for their own kicks, probably based on Puck. Anyway, so yeah, blue and orange morality is essentially the concept that you can have a character who has a moral compass. It's just completely out of alignment with what we consider an average human moral compass. Okay. Decoy protagonists. That's a fun one. The gist of a decoy protagonist is that the story starts off following one character, and then that character gets, like, iced or drops off the map, or the narrator just says this is not their story or whatever. And then it cuts over to some other random schlub who's actually our protagonist. And the gist there is that it's a fun little fake out. It's a little subversion of expectations. And it can be a little tedious and it can be a little bit funny. Most recent example I can think of that did that was Centaur World, which is great because when you start watching the show, there's a rider on a horse. She's, like, riding through this decimated battlefield, and there's a female voice narrating about, the war's been raging, et cetera, all this stuff sucks. We were sent on a mission by the general to retrieve this magic artifact. And long story short, the narrator is the horse, not the rider. And the horse gets isekai'd into, like, a magical bubblegum dimension and has to try and get back to rescue her rider. And it's very funny. And if you're really paying attention, you can kind of tell because we actually hear the rider talking just a little bit, and it's not quite the same voice. You can kind of tell, like, her voice is deeper than the horse's voice. Anyway, so decoy protagonist. It makes you think we're going to be following one person, and it's actually somebody else. Very commonly when they do that, the decoy protagonist looks like the perfect hero. They're like a shining golden god, or they're actively a chosen one or something like that. When I was watching New Legends of Monkey, which I would not recommend, they did that, actually. So the gist of New Legends of Monkey is it's kind of a Journey to the West with all the cultural serial numbers filed off adaptation. They gender bend Tripitaka, obviously, so that they can ship her with Monkey, who looks like a handsome dude all the time. And the show, when I described it to my dad, he said it sounds like how Journey to the West would go if Pigsy was the one writing it, which is very accurate. Pigsy is by far the most noble and heroic character on that show. Anyway, point is, when the show starts, like, Tripitaka shows up, like the actual monk. They're like, oh, you need to go do this magical thingy, collect the MacGuffins to free our land from demon influence or whatever. And then he gets super murdered. And the girl who was, like, listening in because she, like, was a servant in the house or whatever, she sees them get totally murked by demons, and they're like, haha, now nobody will be able to free the Monkey King from the mountain 30 feet over there with this magic scroll. And she's like, oh, I should do that. And then she shaves her head and pretends to be Tripitaka, and astoundingly, nobody notices that she's very clearly a bald woman for a while. Anyway, weird show. Ay. Yes, the Xena-looking show. The show that somehow looks like Xena despite being made in the 2010s. It's, I was having a good time with it, but I kept waiting for it to get better, and instead it got worse. I think the part that broke me is there's an episode where it is revealed that this version of Monkey cannot read or write, and I was like, that's just frankly insulting. So, anyway. Clones/evil clones. What an interesting concept. I feel like, obviously the concept of evil twins and evil copies much predates the science of cloning, because, spoiler alert, there's an evil copy subplot in Journey to the West. Actually, anyone who's watched Lego Monkey Kid probably knows about this. I still haven't sat down to watch it, but I know that there's an arc in it featuring the six-eared macaque, who is the character who perfectly imitates Monkey. He just shows up at one point as like a perfect copy of Monkey, and they spend basically the entire next chapter just fighting while everyone else tries to figure out a way to tell them apart. So the idea of an evil copy of somebody, very old. I wonder if when cloning was like discovered/invented, you got people who were like, oh my god, it's real, we can really make this happen, and then they learned that that's not really how cloning works, unfortunately. You just get a baby. Anyway, so the clone trope is essentially you have a character and someone makes a copy of him. And I want to say it's not recent, but it's more recent than the first concept of a clone, is the idea that you get a clone who's a little different than you. Most commonly, you get like a gender-swapped clone. And I think that entirely exists because of X-23, because she was just such a good version. As I understand it, there's like 4 or 5 more female clones of Wolverine running around in the comics, and it's like, guys, one was good. We don't need more. It's fine. Anyway, usually the idea there is, some writers really like writing mirror matches, aka when you have a character fighting essentially a reflection of themselves, sometimes literally. So you get like, oh, it's their shadow, it's their reflection, it's an evil amorphous blob that's taking their form to mess with their head and steal their powers or whatever. So, you get a lot of that stuff. Because it's cool. You get to see, defeat yourself, fight your inner demons, whatever. All kinds of cool symbolism. And then, you can also play it up for other stuff. For instance, X-23 is mostly, hey, let's let Wolverine be a dad, but like a full-blown dad. Like, let's give him an unattached kid version of himself who is in desperate need of, oh, hey, Blue. Journey to the West enthusiasts have been disappointed when the first clone was just a sheep. I was very disappointed, but it was very funny that they named her Dolly because she was cloned from boob meat. Anyway, but yeah, the evil clone / shadow version / evil copy trope is very popular just because sometimes it's fun to let your hero fight themselves, although those fights almost always have the exact same resolution, which is like, if you have a bunch of heroes and they're all fighting copies of themselves, one of them will be like, hey, let's switch dance partners, and then they'll all remix and they'll fight one of their other friends, or rather one of their evil copies of their friends, which is fun because it sort of scratches that in a fight who would win itch without having to make them hold back, because like, when you have two heroes fighting each other, like, unless they're both being mind controlled, the odds are good that at least one of them is going to be kind of holding back to avoid smacking the other one around too hard. Blue's about to go to bed. That's very commendable of you. We're going to be here for a while. All right. You guys didn't know that's why she was named Dolly? Yeah, it was a hilarious joke. Child clones, all the potential for parent bonds with no relationship drama. That is really the benefit. You get like a traumatized kid version of yourself to raise with none of the complications of having to find a romantic partner and a lifelong relationship out of it. Ooh, I can't control my powers. I have terrible news for you. The TV trope for that is power incontinence. I don't know why they picked that name. It's not inaccurate. It's just not particularly glamorous, especially because this is a trope that so many people love. Like, the idea that you have a character with some kind of superpower, but the superpower is like, maybe it's linked to their emotions, or, you know, their power is kind of like, you know, not necessarily linked to their emotions, but it's something that they don't fully have a handle on. Maybe they don't really know how to control it yet and they're going to learn, or maybe it's something that genuinely can't be controlled. And you end up with a character who essentially, typically the way this plays out is that they need to stay calm. Usually they do end up making this somehow emotion linked, probably because if you have a character who's just minding their own business and then stuff around them starts blowing up, it's like, well, that's just kind of weird, you know? If you give the character, like, yes, chat, that name is awful. I don't know why they did it. Anyway, the gist is that, you know, character with some kind of magical superpower, but whatever it is, they can't fully control it. Superpowered evil sides are very classic for this, but honestly, I think it's a little more dramatic if it's like, it's not even that so much as like the character has power, it's just too much for them. Like, if they can learn to harness it, it'll be great. But until then, they're very dangerous. And this is a really fun trope to explore. It's got great potential for character drama. This is how they play the Avatar state through almost all of Last Airbender until they stick it on the shelf for season 3 because it was getting a little too busted. It's also kind of how they were playing Katara's bending early on, when she's clearly extremely powerful, but she has no training. Like, the first thing we see her doing is break an iceberg because she's, like, angrily slinging her fists behind her. She doesn't even know she's doing it. And in a series that's very adamant about, like, bending power is not corresponded to, like, physical strength, but to care and training and precision of movement, it's kind of interesting that she's, like, wrecking mountains when she's just kind of, you know, flailing her arms around because she's pissed at her dumb brother. So the idea that you have a character with powers they can't fully control is a lot of fun because it sort of automatically balances it out. It's often very difficult to power balance a story where you have a superpowered character running around. You know, this is the problem people have with Superman a lot of the time. It's like, how do you challenge a character who basically can't be physically hurt and can solve almost all problems that would thwart a human being? Usually you throw bigger problems at them or things that can actually hurt them. So the fact that Superman is weak to magic gets thrown around, pitting him up against characters that are about as physically strong as him, like Darkseid or other Kryptonians, that's a way to challenge Superman. But an easier way to challenge someone like Superman is to make it so that they can't fully control their powers. As I understand it, they kind of do that a little bit in Man of Steel, which I can't bring myself to watch because it makes me so mad. But the idea that Superman has never had experience fighting anybody as strong as him, so he can't pull his punches and he keeps wrecking buildings, I don't know. This is not a version of the character I particularly like, but it does technically fall under this umbrella. The idea is essentially that suppose you have a character and they've got a power, and if they could control the power, a lot of the problems that they're facing would just be instantly solved. But if you can come up with a reason for them not to be able to control it, maybe it's very precise, maybe it needs to be honed or trained, then you can put them in all kinds of situations that they could theoretically solve, but that doesn't mean they can practically solve it. Kryptonite, yes, sorry. The obvious way to challenge Superman is to just shove a rock that he's allergic to in his face. But they try not to overuse that because after a while it's like, how much friggin' kryptonite is on this planet? I saw a sarcastic chorus popped up earlier to bring up the trope power born of madness, which is essentially the idea that, like, your sanity's holding you back, man. As mentioned, it's a kind of foundational trope in the anime Soul Eater. And as I recall, that anime is kind of like, yeah, I mean, madness gives you a brief power-up, but ultimately it's kind of bad for you, so we should probably learn how to, like, be badass without it. The idea that a character who's completely unrestrained by things like morals and sanity is more powerful than another character who is restrained is very popular. Excuse me. I think it's popular because it feels realistic. Like, you know, a lot of us, like, if we're angry or frustrated, it can be easy to sort of think like, oh man, if only I didn't have a moral compass. Ooh, I'd really, like, stick it to him or something like that. I'd just, like, whack this person who's annoying me or something like that. And, you know, what we think is holding us back there is our morals, our sanity, you know, whatever, our rationality. And And that's true, but I also think a lot of those people who, like, worry that, oh, who would I be if I indulge this? Or, like, that's not the kind of person who would ever do that, you know? If you're worrying about that, you wouldn't do it. Anyway, the idea that a character can become more powerful by just throwing out their inhibitions and losing all their restraints is, you know, it's popular, and I think it's popular because it feels plausible and cathartic. But in my experience, most stories that use it as a trope sort of do it to unpack it and to bring it back around to, like, yeah, I mean, it feels pretty good, but ultimately it's not worth it and it's not good for you. All right, let's see. I gotta breathe. Oh my god, 40 minutes straight. Superpowered dark side, but edgier and more mental angst. Yeah, but if anything, I feel like it's almost less effective than a classic superpowered evil side. Because if you have a character whose superpowered evil side is like another persona, or it's themselves but completely uninhibited with like perhaps a darker agenda. All right, Ludo History is heading to bed. Thank you so much for managing chat. I will attempt to keep an eye on it while we go. What was I talking about? Come on, brain. Superpowered evil side. Right, so a lot of the angst of the superpowered evil side is brought from the fighting from the inside trope, where the character is still in there and is like trying to push down the superpowered evil side to overwhelm it to, like, you know, protect their friends or you know, minimize the damage being done or whatever. But the thing is, if it's one of those power born of madness things, then it's like, well, the character is still in there because this isn't really appreciably different than the character. You know, they're just kind of being a dick about it. So instead of a dramatic fighting from the inside, it's like, dude, would you please chill out and stop licking stuff? Anyway, sneaky, someone in there being like, whoa, we want to trope talk about the TV show reboot perchance? Like, guys, I already did that last time. Don't be rude to everybody else. Red shirts. Oh boy. Do I even need to explain this? I thought you were going to bed, Blue. I mean, Clippy. Anyway, red shirts. For those of you who somehow missed this, the trope of the red shirt is when you have like a secondary character or a minion or like a random faceless soldier who's really just in the story so that they can die horribly. It's called that because that's how it worked in Star Trek, the original series. Whenever Kirk pulled together an away team, it would be like him and Spock and Sulu and then like 5 or 6 random dudes in red shirts because someone had to get killed by whatever alien menace was on the planet's surface, and it couldn't be Kirk or Spock or Sulu, so just put some of these, you know, random goons up so that they can die horribly and fling themselves at a bunch of styrofoam rocks or whatever. Which is great. Very funny. And then for, like, next generation, they were like, all right, just so nobody accuses us of the same thing, we're going to put the captain and his first mate in red shirts. So you can never really tell. I think then it was yellow shirts because those were the security detail. Anyway, the gist of a red shirt is that they exist solely to die. That's basically it. And there are other character archetypes that exist solely to die. I mean, I have a whole video on mentors. And there's also a trope called the Sacrificial Lion, where they have like a full-blown hero, like a great, you know, noble warrior type who also exists to die. I nearly spoiled the ending of this anime the last time I was streaming. I don't want to do it again, but there is a character in Demon Slayer that I believe it is rather well known in the fan base that they are a sacrificial lion. They exist to be cool and great and heroic and die. Red shirts are not that. It's kind of like the difference between like a meaningful character death and fridging, in that it's like, okay, this character who exists to die, it can happen in a meaningful way, and it can happen in a, oh no, not that guy kind of way. Yeah, they exist solely to get wharfed, basically. They're just there to be like, oh, that thing's no joke. Look at how quickly it killed those 3 nameless goons. When it's a less underdeveloped character, it's usually the dead white-haired anime boy. Oh, and I saw someone with a Ruby reference I actually recognize. Pyrrha Nikos rather notoriously exists as a shining hero type based on Achilles, I think, to die in, like the season 3 finale, something like that. Aslan doesn't really count. I mean, obviously the Jesus imagery means he kind of literally counts, but he comes back, like, immediately. So I guess that's the Jesus thing again. Anyway, badass long coat. See, this is why the trope lightning round is important. I can't make a whole video about the badass long coat. It's like, oh yeah, sometimes characters wear things that are long in the butt. Woo! Anyway, badass long coats are a great look. I think a lot of people, I feel like every 90s anime had at least one. It was either a cape or a trench coat, depending on if it was like fantasy or sci-fi. Trigun has like everybody and their grandma wearing a badass long coat. It's a very fun anime. Actually, that reminds me, this isn't a trope thing, but I don't know if anyone here has watched Kekkai Sensen, Blood Blockade Battlefront. Neither name particularly rolls off the tongue, but it's like exactly up my alley. It's urban fantasy set in New York, but like New York got like magically merged with like an Eldritch Lovecraftian dimension, and everyone was like, it must be Tuesday, and just kind of went on with their lives. It's ideal. It's perfect for me. And I learned like 2 years after I watched it that it's by the guy who made Trigun. And in hindsight, I was like, wow, that's the least surprising thing I've ever heard. It's got very similar themes of like a pacifistic protagonist who goes through the absolute ringer, refusing to hurt people, and a character who looks exactly like Nicholas D. Wolfwood, but is a girl. Anyway, great show. Lots of fun. And so is Trigun, although I think Trigun ran into the problem that like the manga ran for about like 10 times longer than the anime managed. So the anime sort of had to take like a couple ideas from later in the game and just really quickly whip them up into a finale. And I was like, oh, it's done. So then when I read through the manga, I was like, the fuck is happening? None of this was in the anime. Anyway, you know, that's the reverse order from what you're supposed to do. You're supposed to read the manga and then watch the anime adaptation. So you can be like, that wasn't in the manga. Anyway, good stuff. Death flags. Oh boy, that's a specific flavor of foreshadowing when a character is, the story is basically winding up to kill them. Death flags are the byproduct of that, when the story starts foreshadowing that a character is going to die. And they take a lot of forms, but it's mostly in the form of like, we're going to wrap up the character's loose ends, we're going to make them a little bit wistful, we're maybe going to have them say a line specifically about how it'll be like if and when they die and the circumstances under which they want that to happen. Oh man, I don't know if anyone but me watched Mortal Engines, you know, the movie with the cities on treads that eat each other, allegedly based on a better book series. I don't know. But there's a character in there who shows up and she's just the coolest. She gets introduced saving the good guys, and she's got like just a great design, cool sunglasses. And I was like, oh, she's so cool. And then about like 10 minutes before the finale, she's like, you know, I always thought I'd be satisfied if I could like die in the sky. And I was like, oh God, here it comes. Lo and behold, in the finale, she dies falling into a roiling mass of clouds and lightning after getting stabbed. But it's okay. She's like at peace with it, so it's fine. And then like, if anyone's watched the newer Dune version, you know, the good one, as opposed to the other ones, which were all terrible, when they're setting up for the big everything's going to shit attack, and Duke Leto Atreides is hanging out with Lady Jessica, and suddenly every single one of his lines is like, I should have married you, I wish we had more time. And I'm like, do you know? Have you read ahead? What are you doing? Obviously he doesn't survive the night. Anyway, but yes, death flags they're basically a byproduct of the writer attempting to make a satisfying death. So I can't really hold it against them because I like it better than a completely unforeshadowed death out of nowhere for shock value. But death flags are usually there for it to be like, oh boy, it's coming. This character is, oh boy. And sometimes writers play with that deliberately. They did that in Age of Ultron when they were like, oh, here's Hawkeye. You all care about Hawkeye, right? Look at his adorable family. Look at how quippy he is. Sure would be a shame if I Joss Whedoned him in the finale. And then it's like, look, I didn't. I killed this other guy instead. And I'm like, I kind of wish you had killed Hawkeye. Anyway, I've changed my mind about that. I really like the Hawkeye show. I'm just saying, in the context of that movie in isolation, killing Hawkeye would have been more interesting. Anyway, Affably evil. That's a trope for when you have a villain who is evil, but in like a kind of fun way. Like they're just easy to get along with and like talk to. Maybe they have fun banter with the heroes. I was actually, for a trope talk I was working on, I was rewatching chunks of Kim Possible, and every single villain in that show is like written like that. They just have the most casual conversations with the heroes about like fashion choices and just random shit, which is very funny. And that general concept of like the villain has like chill casual banter with the heroes it's an interesting inversion, because a lot of times you have heroes that are just chill and bantering with the villains, but the villains get mad about it. Like that's Spider-Man's whole MO. He'll be throwing out quips, but like whoever he's fighting will be pissed off about it. Sometimes you kind of get the reverse, where like the hero's like, oh, I'll stop you, villain. You can't possibly, someone has to put an end to your schemes. And then the villain's like, oh, hey, man, I was just making a cup of tea. You want some? It's great. And the Desolator's got like another 10 minutes before it warms up, and we got some time to kill. It's a very fun trope. Sometimes it's a little bit divorced from like how they actually work. And sometimes it's a facade. You have a villain who's not actually affably evil. They're just like pretending to be chill. But once you start pushing their buttons and they hit a third act breakdown, all that falls away. You get some villains that are actually kind of affable all the way down. I was rewatching chunks of Gargoyles recently, and there's as I've mentioned, it's a really good show, and everybody should watch it, although you have to be a little bit nice to it because it was made in the 90s, and that means parts of it are just kind of dumb, but that's okay. The beginning involves them like infiltrating a high-tech Zeppelin to steal floppy disks, so you see what we're working with here. But the villain for that show is David Xanatos, a character who has like 4 TV tropes named after him, so you know he's good. And David Xanatos is affably evil. He's totally chill. He's got a lot of evil schemes of various kinds, but like it's never personal for him. And the heroes take it personally a lot, but for him it's like, hey man, it's just business. I'm trying to get super rich and be immortal and live forever with my super hot wife. It's great. There's even a later episode where like he actually like sticks the heroes in a death trap, and he's like, this is my first stab at real cliched villainy. How am I doing so far? And it's like, oh my god, it's so funny. And the rare times where that slips, it's not because it's a facade, it's because somebody's threatening his loved ones and he's actually freaking out. So anyway, great show. Everybody should watch it. David Xanatos is a great example of an affably evil villain where it's not a facade. Let's see. Morbin time. Oh my god. I feel like in the last 3 days that just sort of took over the internet, and it's so funny to me because I don't think I know a single human being who's actually watched Morbius, and to my knowledge, none of the people using that meme have watched Morbius either. It's just like, it's such an inherently funny sound that everyone's just like, yeah, it's Morbin time. That must be pissing them off so much. It's like, we'd be getting so much free publicity if anybody had watched our film. Talk about Transformers. Guys, this is the trope lightning round, not the media lightning round. And besides, my experience with Transformers is very limited. I watched Transformers Prime because, I don't remember who it was, somebody on Twitter linked an episode, or like mentioned an episode as a really good example of a specific trope that I was talking about, which is the trope where there's a whole episode that's basically just the most dangerous game, aka your hero is being hunted by a bad guy. Which is often a great recipe for like an unusually scary episode, or like an unusually desperate episode where a character is alone and has to like really try very hard to survive and outrun the spooky guy hunting them down, which is pretty fun. You know, it's there are some stock episodes that are used to be like, this is the serious episode. This is when like, this is when we take the normal tone and we dip it down into the spooky zone, and then we bring it back up in the next episode for something nice and fun. And I mentioned that, and they were like, oh, there's a great episode of Transformers Prime that does that. And they mentioned the name, and I looked it up, and I watched it. And I was like, that was a really good episode of that. And so I watched the entire rest of the show. So that's my only exposure to Transformers, aside from, like, I watched Bumblebee, which was good, even though after I watched it, I was like, oh, that was just Iron Giant, wasn't it? And I did watch the first Michael Bay Transformers movie, but I did that for a bad movie night, so I don't know if it counts. Godzilla Threshold. That one is not self-explanatory in the title. The Godzilla Threshold, for those of you who don't know, which I'm assuming is most of you, is essentially the level of, oh fuck, things are really bad, that prompts our heroes to be willing to do something very dangerous and possibly worse that they wouldn't otherwise be willing to do. Like, at what level of badness are the heroes willing to unleash Godzilla to solve the problem? That's the Godzilla Threshold. So, like, the premise of this trope requires that your heroes have to have something in the back pocket that is too dangerous for them to normally use. And that can vary a lot depending on the power scale of the story. You can have a character who's just got, like, a superpowered evil side, and they're like, no, I can't unleash the beast, and then something mildly bad happens, and they're like, okay, it's time to unleash the beast. But then you get stories where it's like, they genuinely like they beat a serious villain in like the first arc and the villain's imprisoned, and then like stuff gets bad and they're like, oh fuck, are we gonna need to get that guy to help us out? Oh dang it. So it can be useful. Essentially it's a sign that the stakes are raised, and it also allows for fun spectacle, because essentially what results when the characters do the Godzilla threshold is you get villain versus villain fights, and those can be a lot of fun because villains aren't really restricted like heroes are in terms of what they can do while still being in character so much. Like, you know, they can reach levels of brutality that it's generally frowned upon for your paragon heroes to do. So when you let them fight each other, pretty crazy stuff can happen. You know, it's interesting. I mean, you know, literally speaking, like there are kaiju movies that almost, you know, literally follow the Godzilla threshold. I think, was it King of the Monsters? Yeah, King of the Monsters. They, oh, I have so many thoughts on that movie. Most of them are in the kaiju video, but that movie has, we've got Ghidorah and Godzilla fighting each other. But we're gonna drop an oxygen destroyer on them and kill them both. And it works on Godzilla, but not on Ghidorah. And then it's like, oh no, everything's so much worse now. We should probably go restore Godzilla by nuking him. That'll be fun. And then they do it, and then Godzilla shows up all powered up and just absolutely glowing with Cherenkov radiation. And they're like, this is fine. And then he goes and fights Ghidorah and wins. And it's like, all right, that was the Godzilla threshold. It was oopsies. When Ghidorah's the top dog, everything's way worse. And then you get movies like Godzilla vs. Kong where they were like, well, we need a reason for them to fight, because that's the whole premise of the movie, but we don't really have one, and we've kind of reframed Kong as like the hero of humanity, so we can't really make him be a jerk. So, and then in the last 10 minutes, they're like, here's Mechagodzilla, they can fight him together, woo! So, oh, what a good movie. I mean, no, what a bad movie, but it was very fun to watch, so I'm not going to complain. Cloudcuckoolanders. That's another trope where the name is not particularly indicative of what it means. The gist of the Cloudcuckoolander trope is that it's a character who is not clicked in with reality, but in like a sort of whimsical, charming way. It's like, this is the character who's like... All right, I've been rewatching the Quentin Reviews Victorious video. It's the cat character, you know, the character who's like fully in her own little world, a much chiller, brighter colored world than any of the other characters are dealing with. Or it's a Pyro from TF2. You remember in the like Meet the videos, and everyone else is like having their own things going on, and then Meet the Pyro, it's like, oh look, he's spraying rainbows and marshmallows on everybody, and it's like, nope, that's not actually what comes out of a flamethrower, buddy. So that's the Cloudcuckoolander. It's a character who's just kind of fully checked out with reality, but in a whimsical Charlie the Unicorn sort of way. To be honest, as far as those characters go, they need to do some work to feel, I don't know, grounded or like worth getting emotionally invested in, because if they're not clicked in with reality, it's a little bit hard to get invested in how they work in that reality, you know? Like, you can get some mileage out of it if that character clicks in with reality at rare moments. So they kind of did that. This is actually one of the only bits of character writing I really like in the Sandman comics, because that's how they do Delirium, one of the Endless, who used to be Delight. It's not really explained how she changed or why, but it ends up creating this... she's usually completely checked out of reality, obviously. She's Delirium. She can't really perceive reality, but it's established in the comic that she can, but it hurts. Like, she can sort of roll back how she works and force herself to fully understand everything about reality. And when she does, there's stuff that she knows that not even the other Endless know. And I think that's cool, because that sort of overlaps with a trope that I love, which is the crouching moron hidden badass. You know, you have a character who looks like they're goofy and useless, and then it turns out, oh, they're actually terrifying. But a lot of times the Cloudcuckoolander is just kind of in the background being kind of loopy, and it's like, all right, you know, and as long as they're having fun, okay. Yes, Mabel Pines is an example of this trope done well, and that's because while she is goofy and she has a very chipper, optimistic perspective on the world, she is clicked in with reality enough for it to hurt her. Like, that sounds terrible, but you know what I mean, right? Like, she reacts to things like a real human being would because they upset her and they make her unhappy. Let's see. Oh boy, everything's kind of going. Body swaps. Oh boy. That trope is a mixed bag. Personally, I always get cranky when they body swap characters and then they just have the voice actors swap too. I'm like, biologically speaking, that doesn't make any sense. And also, it deprives the voice actors of a fun opportunity to act as each other, which is why I liked that when they did the body swapping stuff in Dragon Ball Abridged, they were like, screw that. We're going to let the voice actors mess around. We're going to let Masako X do a British accent to be Captain Ginyu, and we're going to let the Ginyu voice actor do his best Goku. You know, that's always more fun. It lets the characters show off. I guess the thing is, body swap arcs they sort of violate the status quo on such a fundamental level that they have to be reset, and that usually means you're just kind of sitting around waiting for them to be reset. So, like, I know that there's a rather well-known arc in the Spider-Man comics where Doc Ock swaps their minds, and, like, so he's running around as Spider-Man, Superior Spider-Man. I don't know anything about it. It doesn't interest me, so I didn't want to read it. But it's like, that's such an inherently unsustainable system. It's like, oh, we're going to take a hero defined as like a paragon whose life sucks, and we're going to put a supervillain's brain in his body for like years. It's like, oh yeah, that sounds super not tedious. Anyway, I'm also not that invested in the personal character development of Doc Ock, so it's like, I don't care if he learns to like being a hero. I kind of just want him to get out of Peter Parker's body. Anyway, so body swaps they're kind of a mixed bag. They're fun, especially in moderation. So like sometimes they'll just do episodes where it's like, everyone's got body swapped. What are we going to do? Everyone's got to figure out how to use each other's powers, and they come away with a newfound understanding of each other when they all got body swapped back, no problem. Which is fun. That's kind of fun. But, yeah, I don't know. It's a gimmick trope. You know, there are a lot of gimmick tropes that can't really go anywhere. They just sort of like, they distort the plot, but then they have to snap back into position afterwards. Oh God, the multiverse. Don't get me started on the multiverse. I don't know. I've been ranting about the multiverse a lot in the last few days. There is nothing that makes me less interested in the status quo of a story or the stakes of a story than introducing a multiverse into the equation. And the only exception is Everything Everywhere All at Once, because the point of that movie is the character is given access to a multiverse and said, hey, doesn't this render everything meaningless? And she's like, no. And then the movie ends. Like, I mean, that's a grotesque oversimplification, but the point is, like, essentially that is the one movie where it's like, here is a multiverse, and yet, even though there is a multiverse of infinite possibilities, this is the world we are living in, and we are going to choose to focus on that. Whereas most stories introduce a multiverse so that they can get away with breaking their own rules or violating their own, like, established plot progressions without necessarily locking themselves out of those future arcs. Every time a superhero universe introduces a multiverse, it just makes things less interesting. And oftentimes what it means is that the stakes of any given world are completely reduced. It's like, you know, when you start an episode and the characters, like, time travel to, like, the distant future. You know, none of this is going to mean anything. Like, they're just, you know, they're just messing around. By the end of the episode, they'll be back and everything will be fine. And then you get, I just realized I've been holding a mug of tea and I haven't drunk any of it, but I have managed to spill a small amount of it on myself. So that's on me. Okay, let me put this down and stop making things worse. Anyway, the point is, when a superhero universe especially introduces a multiverse, usually what they're doing is saying, hey, we're going to make a universe where this exciting thing happened and a universe where this exciting thing happened, but we are not going to have to explore the consequences of any of those things. And what that means is that, you know, you get all these interesting base concepts and they get briefly explored and then scrapped. Like, I enjoyed about 50% of Marvel's What If, but a lot of that was because it's like, hey, the Captain Britain episode is fun because it's just like the Captain America movie, but Bucky's okay. That's cool. You know, whatever. It's like, it's a fun little what if, but it doesn't go any further than that. But once you start using the multiverse to cut off things that are interesting possibilities or pair them off into their own little universe so that they can't interfere with other stuff, it's just a huge mess. And it's like, you'd think that these guys would have learned from Crisis on Infinite Earths that doesn't work. Like, the whole reason they did Crisis is because they were like, we've got too many multiverses, get rid of them. But obviously that doesn't work. It's like, what's that? I think there's like an XKCD about this where it's like, everyone's like, oh, all these programming languages are so complicated. I'm going to make one perfect programming language that consolidates everything. And all that means is that now there are N+1 programming languages for people to be confused about. It's like that. It's like, oh, we're going to fix the multiverse. We're going to kill off about half of all the characters everybody likes because that's a great idea in a giant freeform media like a superhero universe. And then we're going to mash them all into one universe so they can all hang out, and that'll be great. And then the next writer's like, yeah, but I want to do one where Dick Grayson turns into a vampire, and then suddenly you're back in the multiverse. This is also why I completely fell off the wagon on the Flash CW show, because, like, as soon as they started flashpointing and changing the timeline, I was like, all right, I can no longer be invested in anything because any of this could change at any moment. And that is like the number one way to break your investment in a linear progression of the plot. It's like, oh, I would love to know what's happening. I would love to get invested in these characters and their arcs and growth, except I don't trust the writers to do that anymore. And, oh man, not to blame the addition of the multiverse, but it is always the fault of the addition of the multiverse because it lets the writers get around yes-anding. Instead of that, they can just be like, well, no, we're doing this in a universe where, like, all this shit is different. It's like, okay, cool, there are no stakes anymore. It's like, you know, it's like the Marvel What If episode where it's like, oh, it's zombies. I'm like, great, this is a dead timeline. None of this is going to work out. Everybody's going to be dead, and it's not going to mean anything. And it doesn't. At the end, they're like, we're going to pull a bunch of people out of different multiverses, and then we're going to throw them at a big bad guy, and they're all going to fight him, and then we're going to put him back later, maybe. And it's like, none of this means anything. There's no stakes. Oh, hell yeah, Owl House. Was there a new episode that I missed? Oh, no. Anyway, hero with evil powers. Oh god, that's such a fun trope. And yes, Raven is the perfect example. Even more so in the comics where she's like extra evil. They like sort of toned it down for the cartoon because it was for kids. Everybody was aged down. Like in the comics, like they're like late teens at most. Homestuck. Oh no, is there a multiverse in Homestuck? Wait, don't tell me. That can't be what my chat becomes. Anyway, yes, heroes with evil powers. It's a pretty simple bit of just internal conflict. You have a character who is a good-hearted person who wants to do good, but their powers are morally dubious. Maybe they are a demon, or they get their powers from demons, or in more like actively grounded cases, oh, this character's power is literally fueled by like harming innocents, or like, you know, something that has an actual negative effect on the world around them. This is uncommon. Most heroes with evil powers, it's just like they have a superpowered evil side, or they have like shadow powers and they're really angsty about it, which is fine. Nothing wrong with a little bit of angst and self-loathing, especially the kind where it's like, if this character is just suitably loved by their friends, eventually they'll chill out and be fine. But you also get characters who have like superpowers that are genuinely like harmful to others to use. Is like, okay, this character wants to do good, but they are literally radioactive. There's not a lot they can do with that. So, you know, it's an interesting exploration. A lot of times it just gets used for angst, which is honestly like, it's okay. It's got its place. This gets explored a lot in the X-Men because, oh man, getting the X gene is like, it's like I don't know. It's like a lottery where half the results are really bad. Because it's like, oh, you might be a literal god, or you might have cool eye beams, or you might disintegrate all biological matter within 500 yards of you, including people. That's fun. Oh no, it just never goes well. Like it's a complete crapshoot, and a lot of those guys, like they've got all the best intentions in the world, but ultimately the effect they have on the world around them is very negative. And a lot of those stories just focus on the angst. They're like, wouldn't it be sad if that was true? And it's like, yeah, it would be. There's one issue of an X-Men run that I've read, which is literally that. Basically, a kid, he wakes up one morning, and he doesn't really realize what's going on for a while, but eventually he figures out that everybody near him is disintegrating. And basically at the end of the issue, Wolverine tracks him down and finds him in this cave and basically fills him in on what's going on. Because, of course, Professor X was like, an entire town is getting very slowly wiped off the map. Can you go check it out? Our one character who can't die? And Wolverine's like, yeah, okay. And he goes there. And And basically the gist is that this kid just had his X gene activate, and unfortunately his mutant power is disintegrating all organic matter within like 500 yards of him, which means everybody who gets near him dies except for Wolverine, because that's like his one thing. And basically Wolverine has to kill him. But there's a bit where the kid's like, man, it's like, you know, a gene like 1 inch to the left, and I could have been an X-Man, and I'm like, oh God. So like, there are some characters who have evil powers, and it's like, they'll be fine. Just let them get the angst out of their system, and they'll get like a color swap power up, and it'll be fine. And then there are some characters where it's like, that's just deeply unfortunate. And yeah, very tragic. Let's see. I actually have read Immortal Hulk, at least a good chunk of it. I'll be honest, I was really into it like in the first couple arcs, and it kind of jumped the shark after they went to hell. And then it just kept getting weirder. But I did like the basic premise, which was essentially like the Hulk's real superpower is that he cannot die no matter what. But anyway, let's see. Oh boy, it's just a list of tropes. Oh, characters trapped in a virtual reality, the Matrix plotline. I don't really know how much there is to do. Well, okay, that's not true. There's a lot to do with that trope. I just don't know how much I like it exactly. It's another story format that kind of reduces the stakes, or at least shuffles them around. There are stories I've run into that have more stakes when they do virtual reality arcs, mostly Yu-Gi-Oh! where when they have an arc where it's like, oh, we're stuck in a virtual reality, and also if you die in the game, you die for real. It's like, wow, that's way more stakes than we normally have in our card games. But in most stories where it's like, oh, we're going into a virtual world, it's like, all right, don't get hurt too badly. If your hit points hit 0, it'll be bad. I don't know. It's I kind of talked about this, I guess, in the Isekai, well, Magical Otherworlds video, because a lot of those are just straight up virtual realities, and it's like, well, the universe has rules, but depending on what those rules are, it can either have way more or way less in the way of stakes. Yep, Sword Art Online is like the example. I feel like I watched a season of that show, but I can't remember any of it, so maybe I just watched a little bit of it. Anyway, it wasn't good. Everybody knows that. Oh, chat. Slowly catching up. Yep, all that Sword Art Online hate. Ooh, evil versus evil. We kind of talked about that when we were talking about the Godzilla threshold, where, you know, the heroes must unleash something truly terrible to fight the other truly terrible thing. Excuse me. But to be honest, that's not the only way that evil versus evil can play out, because, like, you can have villains that just don't like each other or have opposing life goals, and that can honestly be really, really fun. And this is a side of things where it's like villains can, in a lot of stories, do worse things than the heroes. They can do more amoral things. They can, you know, they can hurt people in nastier ways. And sometimes if your heroes are like dealing with a problem and the problem is a real pain in the ass, it can be kind of cathartic to have like a bad guy show up who's like normally a really bad problem for the heroes, who's like, oh, I'm so sick of this guy, and just like starts unloading all the normal villainous brutality they have reserved for the heroes onto this bad guy that we're rooting to be destroyed. I don't know, it's interesting. It's like, it's a rare case where you're not really rooting for either side to win, but it's still really fun to watch. Yes, Ra's al Ghul is a very fun example of that, because he's one of the Batman villains with like a moral code, or at least a code that involves frequently siding with Batman. Like, he's a terrible person, but in most versions, he's like, all right, when the detective gets his head around his shoulders and maybe lives another couple hundred years and then decides that leading the League of Assassins is the right thing to do, I'll be able to take him in as my apprentice. And until then, I'll just keep him alive and stop him from blah, blah, blah. And it's a fun example. Like, you can get this when villains have, like, need for certain heroes, or like a plan for them, or just they like them. That's another thing. You can have, like, villains who get along fine with the heroes, and the heroes are like, I oppose you on moral grounds, and the villain's like, yeah, mimosas on Thursday. It's a very funny dynamic. And when that happens, you can easily have the villain show up and be like, I'm here to stop this other bad guy because he's really horning in on my bingo time. Anyway, you can also get villains who are in the process of being, like, slowly redeemed or sort of starting on a redemption arc, who will like contrive excuses to show up and help, typically of the I was just passing through and I saw you needed help variety, which can be pretty fun. Not to harken back to like the show that consumed my every waking thought from like the ages of 14 to 15. But they do that a lot in Inuyasha with one specific character, Sesshomaru, who is a villain when he's early on introduced. He's just like the worst. He's like dickhead older brother, kind of racist against humans. And then he kind of gets beaten up a couple times. And after about the third time, he sort of takes the hint, adopts a kid who is a human, starts sort of very slowly climbing the ladder up to being a less terrible person. But for like the middle 50 episodes of that show, whenever he shows up, all the characters are like, oh my god, it's a Sesshomaru, we better get ready for a fight. And then he'll just do something like unconditionally good, like fight the bad guy or like knock out the hero when he's stuck in his superpowered evil side and be like when the hero wakes up and he's fine, Sesshomaru just leaves. They're like, whoa, could it be possible that Sesshomaru was trying to help us? Also, who's that kid hanging around him? And it's like, guys, you'd think you'd figure this out by now. He's clearly not a problem anymore. Anyway, it's a very fun trope, especially if it is used to signal that a villain is becoming a better person, because, you know, that's always just kind of fun. Like, especially if it doesn't nerf the villain in the process, because that does happen sometimes, you know, when a bad guy becomes a good guy. Sometimes they stop doing all the cool stuff that made them fun to watch as a bad guy. But not always. Sometimes you get villains who are like, you know, you become a good guy, doesn't mean you stop murdering people, just means you change the people you murder. And it's like, whoa, guys, whoa. You know, they can still have ideological conflicts with the heroes, and the heroes can still be butthurt about all the stuff they did when they were bad guys. But now the villain is trying to do good, and that can be a lot of fun. And oftentimes, a hero-villain team-up to fight another villain is a great way to start that. Sorry, shout out to the comment that says Sesshomaru shows up, punches Inuyasha, doesn't elaborate further, leaves. That happens like 8 times. It's very funny. It's like after a while it's just like, is this a villain thing or just being an older brother? Did you just punch out Cthulhu? Another oddly specific name of a trope. Also, can I just say there's like more than 3,000 of you right now? Like, this is a shockingly high turnout. Like last time we averaged out about 2,000 viewers total. Wow, it's almost like having a cohesive plan going into this is more appealing than just being like, I'm sitting in front of a microphone and even I don't know what's about to happen. Anyway, the trope, did you just punch out Cthulhu? The idea there is essentially that our heroes are fighting something inconceivably powerful like a god or an eldritch abomination or like, you know, I guess those are basically the two categories, or some combination of the two. And they do something to it that does serious damage, unexpectedly so in a lot of cases. Sometimes it's like a power-up that the hero just got, especially if like the hero is like, oh no, I'm struggling to defeat this guy, and then the bad guy's like, and then I'll also kill your dog, and the hero gets like a rage power-up. It's like, not my dog, and then he punches him, and like the bad guy's like, whoa, I actually felt that, how can this be? And it's like, oh, did you just punch out Cthulhu, bro? How'd you do that? So that's the gist. It's like, oh wow, how did you even do that? Frequently not explained, especially in settings like shonen anime where people just get randomly stronger sometimes. Oh my god. At this point, we're like 2 for 2 for random tropes I brought up and people in chat being like, so Homestuck then. Guys, I haven't read Homestuck. I don't know anything about Homestuck. It's never going to be used as an example. Let's see. Ooh, the hero going into the villain's mind, or more broadly, just any sort of like character takes an excursion into another character's mind. Those tropes can be really, really fun. I think they're essentially shortcuts to not character development, but character revelations. Like, one of the hardest parts of writing can be essentially showing the characters what is happening, showing the audience what's happening in a character's head, especially the subtle intricacies of it, or when the character's going through something especially complicated that you really want to delve into the like intricacies of. Sometimes what you can literally do is be like, oh, we made like a magic portal and now the heroes can go into their head and do stuff. Have fun. And then it's like, okay, now you're in like a symbolic representation of their mindscape. Have fun. And honestly, that can be really interesting. It's one of those rare cases where like the reduced stakes can actually make it more fun to watch, because it's like, if you drop a character in a magical otherworld and it's like, oh no, what are the rules here? It's really scary. That can kind of almost distract you from enjoying the story, because you're like, gosh, I hope they get home soon. But if it's like, hey, I've dropped you in the mind of this character, like everything in here is going to be an important revelation about this character, you know, you might get a little beat up, but ultimately you'll be okay, have fun, and enjoy. And that can almost be like relaxing because you can just sort of sit back and be like, all right, I don't need to worry about their well-being. They might say something like, oh, if you die in here, you'll be lost forever in their mindscape, but ultimately it's like, look, they'll be fine, okay? We're not that worried. If anything, it's like, oh, it's a mindscape, so, you know, you can get horribly injured, but you'll be fine because it's not your actual body. And then you come out and you're like, oh, it's okay, I'm cool. It didn't really get stabbed, whatever. So what this means is that you have stakes that the characters are aware of that the audience is not super stressed over. So they can actually focus on the important character revelations. So, like, you know, you have a character who's got complex inner turmoil, but, you know, maybe the characters don't know, and then they go inside their mindscape and they're like, wow, there's so much happening. Not to loop back to Teen Titans again, but there is an early episode that does that. I'm sure people remember because it's like one of the first, oh, this is a good show, actually, episodes. I think like Beast Boy and Cyborg break into Raven's room for some reason, and they find a magic mirror, and they get sucked inside it, and they end up in this weird, like, a hell dimension full of spooky ravens, and then Raven is also there. And then it turns out, spoiler alert, they're inside Raven's mind, and they're, like, dealing with fragments of Raven's personality, which is very fun, because up until this point, Raven has just been a spooky goth lady with, like, darkness powers who gets easily taken out by thrown cars. Anyway, it's a good episode, and it's pretty much the first part that foreshadows Trigun, and considering how long it takes them to get to the Trigun arc, like, it's actually pretty impressive that they were dropping in details about it that early. Anyway, so in short, I'm a big fan of journeys into the mindscape and all that fun stuff, and I don't know, I love battles in the center of the mind, I love the fighting from the inside tropes, it's just a lot of fun. Trope talk, stupid evil. Oh, what a simultaneously complicated and simple space of tropes. The gist of stupid evil is that you have villains who are just dumb, especially like their being evil makes them dumb. As far as tropes go, it's not that complicated. I think it tends to be done accidentally. Like, you get characters who are like, I'm so evil that I'm gonna, you know what? I could just kill you, but maybe what I'll do instead is put you in this easily escapable death trap. Mwahaha. And it's like, oh yeah, you really got me, bro. So it's like, you know, those are villains where it's like, you know, if you actually were the evil mastermind you seem to be, according to the script, you probably wouldn't do that, but, you know, the plot has to happen sometimes. So, you know, it's less of a trope and more of like a byproduct of bad writing, if that makes sense. Trope talk, lawful stupid. That's, I think, more interesting than stupid evil, because lawful stupid is actually making a statement, whereas stupid evil is like, well, if the villains are smart, this will be too hard for the heroes. Lawful stupid is the idea that you have a character who is, on paper, you'd probably define them as lawful good or lawful neutral, as in they adhere to a code and they follow laws, but they do it without really engaging their brain. So this is the character who's like, I don't care that the supervillain is right over the horizon. You totally littered there, so you're under arrest, even if you are the only one who can save us. So, like, that's obviously kind of a Flanderization of it, but, like, the gist of lawful stupid is that this is a character who prioritizes the law over anything, which is very relaxing, because you can do that without ever using your brain. This is a pretty common way to make antagonists that aren't full-blown evil villains, but are problems, especially if your heroes are a little more, like, chaotic or perhaps socially unacceptable or whatever. This is essentially an easy way to cause problems for them. If you have a character dealing with an evil empire, you can have lawful stupid employees of the evil empire who are just like, well, it says on my rules and regulations that absolutely no heroic rebelling is allowed, so get out of here, you know, all that stuff. Anyway, it's a pretty good, easy way to make antagonists that could potentially improve but don't necessarily have to for the story to happen. Let's see. Oh yes, stupid evil can also apply to villains that do stuff that is so horrendously evil that it's actively self-destructive, but that's not necessarily stupid evil. You can also have self-destructive evil. You can have evil characters who are just so steeped in self-loathing that they do things that are bad for themselves without really caring about it. You know, late-stage Shira Katra does that. I also saw someone drop the trope, Dick Dastardly stops to cheat, which is a classic example of this. I wish I could remember the cartoon he's from. I'm sure chat will tell me. But the gist there is that, like, Dick Dastardly would be, like, doing a car race, and he's clearly winning, but he can't leave well enough alone, so he stops the car, and he stops to cheat. He does a cheat, but then because he's cheating, the heroes overtake him and win. It's like, oh, yeah, you know, This is just an example of, like, the villain would just win if they were smart about it, but the villain has to lose for the plot to happen, so the villain will be stupid about it. Let's see. Trope talk, the power of love. Oh boy. That's one that, like, so often it feels like utterly hollow to me. And I don't know if that's just me, because it's completely plausible that this is just a blind spot I have. But there are stories I've seen where, like, a character sort of appealing to their connection with another character makes sense as a way to, like, snap them out of something or help them out or, you know, give them the will to carry on. But then there's stories I've seen where it's like the button to progress the plot is a character telling another character they love them. Why does that work? It has to. We need this romantic subplot to help. Oh boy. I've already complained about Samurai Jack Season 5 to you guys, I'm sure. But, like, oh boy. You know, I knew I was ace when I watched that, but if I didn't before, I probably would have figured it out then. Because it was physically painful watching all the stuff they did with that romantic subplot, because it felt so soulless and empty of actual character. And the real, just the peak of that, the pinnacle, is like up on the finale. The gist is that Ashi, the new girl character / love interest of the season, is like a daughter of Aku, and Aku's being evil, and then he's like, oh shit, you got some of my essence in there jellying up your jam. I guess I'll totally possess you. And Ashi's like, what? Oh fuck. And then she gets possessed and totally beats up Jack, and it's like, oh no. And she's being evil and stuff, and Jack is like, oh no, all is lost. And then he takes about 10 minutes to say, Ashi, I love you. And then immediately everything is fixed. And I was like, okay, explain to me why that worked. Why did she need to hear that when they've been macking on each other constantly for the last 5 episodes? Whatever. Anyway, so sometimes power of love totally makes sense. It's like, okay, this is a character who's like, maybe their powers are based on emotion, and a lot of it is based on self-image, and being told that they are loved and genuinely appreciated by the people around them can actually really help. And sometimes it's like, well, I need the character to win somehow. And you know what? People always buy that. Oh, look, my crush said they love me, so I now have super strength. And sometimes that's charming and cute. I liked when they did that in that one time in Yu Yu Hakusho. But a lot of times I'm like, I was hoping that maybe this would make sense, and it doesn't. Anyway, it bugs me, you know. It's, oh, thank goodness. As a straight guy, that was also painful to watch. That's a huge relief. I don't know how that show happened, to be completely honest. I don't know how that decision happened. But there's an episode that's like, it felt like it was being made by someone who hated romantic subplots, but was contractually obligated to include one. So they were like, you know what? Fine. This episode has every single meet cute in it, all at once. And you know what annoyed me most about that? There's a bit in that episode where Ashi gets, like, attacked by, like, acid slugs, and you're never gonna believe this, they dissolve her clothes. Wowzers. And they do the thing where she's like, I have no concept of nudity as a social taboo. And Jack is like, I totally do. Oh, this is so embarrassing. But I remembered that a couple episodes prior, it had been a big deal that Ashi had, like, scraped off her, like, evil Aku, like, second skin coating and was left naked, and noticed that this was a problem and created clothes for herself out of nearby leaves and plants. So either she has a concept of nudity, or she's born sexy yesterday, and the show couldn't decide which one to do. Ay, ay, ay. Well, it's refreshing to know that even people who like that trope thought that was physically agonizing, and I wasn't alone. Let's see. You know, I'm a little suspicious at how many people are bringing up tsunderes and yanderes. It's been a while since I dealt with any of that stuff, but, any of that stuff. My anime days are behind me. No, they're not. Who am I kidding? But My only exposure with yanderes is the cartoonish train wreck that is Yandere Simulator, and that one time I watched all of Mirai Nikki, which I wouldn't recommend. It's one of those shows where I finished it and then I was like, wow, I didn't like any of that. Why did I watch it? So, anyway, the for those of you who are not as weeby, a yandere is a character who is murdery and obsessed with a protagonist, typically in a like, I'm in love with you, but also I maybe want to murder you, but also maybe I want to murder anyone else who looks at you, and just really into murder kind of way. And a tsundere, despite sounding similar, is a character who acts like they don't like you, but also they like you. They're not that complicated. I don't know. It's a whole thing. Is the oh god, red wife, you've forsaken yourself a response to me watching Mirai Nikki? I was young, I didn't know any better. Oh god, the manic pixie dream girl. Yeah, that's probably not worth a full trope talk just because other people have already made videos about that, but the gist of the manic pixie dream girl is that your protagonist is not the manic pixie dream girl. Your protagonist is some guy, usually the writer with the serial numbers filed off, and he's like, oh, my life is like, I don't know, depressing or something, unsatisfying. If only I had somebody to bring excitement into it through no work of my own. And then the manic pixie dream girl shows up, and she's like, what's up? I'm super cute and quirky, and for some reason attracted to you. And I do all these fun, weird things, and I bring excitement and vibrancy into your life. And the guy's like, wow, you really do serve to make my story that much more satisfying, don't you? And then the story ends. I don't know. Not that much appeal to me. Obviously, I'm not the target audience for those things, so I haven't really dealt with them very much. Trope talk. Save nature. Is that a trope, or is that just a thing we need to actually do? I think it started off as a trope because it wasn't as well known in general that it absolutely needed to be done. So, like, people who could kind of read the writing on the wall and be like, oh, this isn't good, was like, hey, nature's beautiful. Maybe we should stop destroying it. People are like, yeah, it sounds fake. And nowadays it's like, oh, look, we're all trying to catch the guy that did this. Anyway, I'm wholeheartedly in favor of Save Nature stories, mostly because they are all from Studio Ghibli, a studio that shaped a good chunk of my psyche. It has been very funny. This is directly related, I promise. It's been very funny watching Poison Ivy shift from being a full-blown villain to an anti-hero at worst without in any way changing. Like, her personality's the same. Her methods haven't even changed. It's just now it's a lot harder to be like, ooh, eco-terrorism, bad. I don't know. Anyway, oh no, it's just all tropes. Oh god. The trope talk, what measure is a mook? We were actually talking about that very early in the stream. The idea of like, there's like a category of people that it's just okay to just wreck shop on and like kill indiscriminately. What measure is a mook is basically another way to say that. It's like the hero will mow down the faceless minions of evil, no problem, but then they'll get to the villain and be like, no, if I kill you, I'll be just as bad. And it's like, what about all those other guys who deserved it way less? Some of these are just trope talks I've actually done. I saw Chosen Ones and Advanced Ancient Civilizations in there. Guys, I have episodes about those. I actually also talked about the doppelganger nemesis thing earlier, as the mirror match idea, or like the character who's like fighting an evil copy of themselves or a clone or their shadow or something like that. Honorable Assassin. That's like a specific subtrope of the broader trope, which is generally called Noble Demon, when you have a villain who is a not decent person, but they have a moral code. Excuse me. So the Noble Demon character is like the bad guy who, like, they usually signal pretty early on that they're not as bad as like their boss frequently. They'll be like wailing on the hero, and then like maybe someone will be like, no, don't hurt him, and like intervene, and they'll be like, hey, my quarrel's not with you, scooch, get out of the way, and like they won't attack him or whatever. It's like in the Magnificent Bastards video, I mentioned that sometimes villains will be given kick the dog moments where they'll do something just dickish like kicking a dog, so that the heroes in the audience are like, oh, what a terrible person, fully irredeemable. Well, sometimes you get villains moments that are the exact opposite of that, where they have the opportunity to do something that's like evil, and they're like, oh, none for me, thanks. No thanks, I'm good. Anyway, this is essentially a way to imply that a character who is clearly villainous is not as bad as they appear. Maybe they're going to be redeemable someday. You know, they had an opportunity to do something bad and they chose not to. And having like an assassin with kind of like a heart of gold or like a moral code, or like, oh, I don't kill kids or whatever. It's like, oh, what a great guy. See, he doesn't kill kids. Anyway, you get, you get bad guys that have established codes or moral character. And frequently those guys will break away from the bad guys once they're like, oh, wait, the bad guys I'm running with are just kind of jerks. It can be fun. Doesn't always mean that they're going to become a good guy, but it does mean that they can be pretty cool. Oh, God, enemies to lovers. You want me to talk about a fan fiction trope? I mean, I guess it's also like a non-fanfic trope. You wanted me to talk about a romance trope? Okay, well, as I understand it, the appeal of enemies to lovers is you have two characters that hate each other, except maybe they don't. Maybe they just want to boink. I don't know. In the cases where I understand, it's like you have two characters that hate each other, but they slowly learn like they've got more in common than they think, or like one of them catches the other one in a moment of vulnerability and they're like, oh, you know what? I get it. Or, okay, I thought you were terrible, but actually there's a glimmer of humanity underneath that spiky carapace of yours. And then afterwards, like, you can get them slowly growing closer together, and after a while they're just casually rescuing each other, and it's like, okay, cool. But sometimes you get the cases where it's like they hate each other, but also maybe they want to boink, and I'm like, all right, I don't get it, whatever. Catra to Adora is a unique case because they were besties to enemies to lovers, and that one makes sense because I was like, well, we already know they get along okay and care about each other a lot, but you get cases where it's like, I don't really get it, whatever. This is wow, you guys really like that I was talking about a trope I fully don't understand. Stop bringing up Homestuck. God, it's 3 for 3 with you people. Trope talk and nightmare fuel. What is there to say? Nightmare fuel isn't a trope. It's just a thing that happens. The gist of nightmare fuel is that something happens in a story that'll give you nightmares. It's incredibly subjective. Varies a lot from character to character. From audience to audience, because what makes something nightmare fuel highly dependent on individual people's phobias, how old they are when they're watching it. I was watching a bunch of new Doctor Who when I was like 10, and oh baby, I had nightmares about that gas mask thing for a like month more. Anyway, but if I watched it now, it would be creepy, but it wouldn't haunt my dreams. So like nightmare fuel is so subjective, I feel like it's not even a helpful trope to discuss, because it's just like wow, this is going to really age when I was dealing with TV tropes. But for those of you who use TV tropes recently, you may not be aware that there was a time when there was a tropes page for fetish fuel, aka stuff in media that was like fetishes and stuff. And they had to get rid of the page because people were just filling it with like their fetishes. And for a while, I think there was like a parallel wiki that was just for the fetish stuff that had been nuked, which was extremely funny. And it was mostly like, how sometimes someone will frame something as an objective fact, but it accidentally reveals a lot about them as a person? That was that entire experience. Anyway, so Nightmare Fuel is almost similar to that. It's like a lot of personalized things that, freak you out. But for other people, it's like, yeah, that's a little gross. Yeah, that's a little weird. Stop bringing up Totally Spies. How messed up does that show have to be that whenever I bring up anything like this, people are like, oh, like Totally Spies. Good God. Anyway, oh, it's funny for me watching you guys like react seconds later to the nightmare that is the Fetish Fuel Tropes page. Trope Talk Dead All Along. That's it's a stock plot twist, but it's a stock plot twist because of The Sixth Sense. Other stories have done it. An Occurrence at Owl Creek Bridge is probably, it's not quite the right one. That one's dying all along. But the gist of Dead All Along is that a character who you thought was alive is revealed to not have been alive. Obviously, the archetypical version is the Sixth Sense, where the dude is dead all along, he's a ghost, and the kid he's talking to is like, I see dead people, they don't know that they're dead. For the record, I haven't watched this movie, because I already know how it ends. Hey! But anyway, the gist is that, like, oh, you thought this character was alive, but actually they're dead. It's usually used as, like, a knife-twisty plot twist. Sometimes it's used as sort of like a cathartic thing. I know that there's, I feel like there are a couple horror shows, like either currently running or recent, that had this whole thing as like their premise, because it is a fun premise to play with. You know, the idea of like, this is a person who's still walking around who doesn't realize that they're a ghost, basically. You know, there's a lot of angst and drama you can play for that. I mean, ultimately, it's generally, I won't say it's generally accepted, but there are essentially two ways to write ghosts. There's the ones that know they're ghosts and the ones that don't. And typically the ones that don't know they're ghosts are the ones that, like, replay the actions they did in life, or, like, you know, they're like little degrading fragments of memories they play out over and over again. But the ones that do know they're ghosts are like, oh, I'm going to turn into a spooky monster, and I'm going to scare you out of here, or whatever. And depending on which version you do, the dead all along reveal can or can't work. Anyway, it's pretty cool. It's generally, it's the kind of trope that sort of reframes the entire story. So, like, when you include it, you sort of have to make your story be about it. There are a lot of tropes that aren't like that. They're, like, more granular. You can use them for filler episodes or just individual characters. This one is kind of big, you know? I don't think I've ever seen anyone apply it to, like, a secondary character who sticks around after the reveal. It's like, oh, our plucky sidekick has actually been dead for the last 3 years, but he still hangs out around here. I guess they kind of did that in DuckTales 2017, but that's because that show is a masterpiece everybody should watch. Oh yeah, I've been seeing a few people be like, oh, trope talk about evil gods, which is really not that different from a trope talk on, like, Eldritch Abominations or evil emperors. It's like, hey, what if this authority figure that you really wish wasn't evil was evil? The thing with evil gods is I think it's like a staple in JRPGs where it's more common for your heroes to just be able to fight and kill gods in the finale. Which is pretty fun. But gods being jerks rather than evil is actually rather more long-standing because, of course, from a certain point of view, that's kind of how Greek mythology works. Where it's like you have these characters that are these, like, semi-omnipotent, godly beings. I mean, describing a god as godly feels like a cheat, but you know what I mean. But also they're jerks. And, like, you know, what do you do when they do jerky things? Well, in Greek mythology, you kind of just deal with it. But in more modern stories, sometimes you, like, I don't know, go and fight him. Pull a Kratos. Could be fun. Or a, whatever that thing they're doing in Thor Love and Thunder is, that guy who looks suspiciously like Kratos. Anyway, I mean, there's stuff you can do with it. It's just, like, it's a little bit tricky because unless your characters can fight gods, adding an evil god to a story is just kind of like, hey, wouldn't it be fun if I added a constant source of conflict that you can't do anything about? And the answer to that is usually, no, that wouldn't be fun. Why would that be fun? Adding a threat that your heroes can't do anything about to a story can be frustrating. And evil gods are pretty bad about that. People keep bringing up clones this episode. The trope talk on cloning blues is kind of covered in the trope talk on evil clones and clones in general. Sometimes a character figures out their clone and they get really sad about it because they're like, oh no, I'm not an original person or whatever. And it's like, nah, I mean, you know, nature versus nurture, you're going to be fine. Trope talk, villain can't lose. Speaking of frustrating things the heroes can't do anything about, sometimes in stories the villain is basically invincible. And that's annoying. And sometimes it can be more annoying if the villain's not invincible, but they still can't lose because of the needs of the plot. It's like, well, if they killed the villain now, we couldn't have the rest of the story. So the villain's got to win or get away or whatever. And that could just be annoying, you know? It's like, ultimately, it feels like nothing the heroes do matters because after a certain point, you're aware that the hand of the author is just like, the villain can't lose. As much as I, as mentioned, really like Inuyasha, that is a problem it started running into, like 2 seasons in. Once it's clear that Naraku's the threat, but also, like, the only threat, like, he's the only reason that everyone's hanging out, well, they obviously can't do anything, really. Like, they can hurt him sometimes, but then he just regenerates or rebuilds himself stronger, so the stuff they used on him last time doesn't work again. And it's like, well, okay, cool, there's no chance that we're ever going to beat this guy until the absolute finale, which is fine. I mean, it's a show that I like because I think it works best in the episodic middle bit when they're not, like, actually looking to fully end the series. But it is a source of frustration. There's a reason a lot of people complain about how, like, oh, Naraku's the big villain, and there's literally, like, he's just constantly indestructible or using puppets or whatever. He's cheating, it feels like, and it's annoying. All right, let's see. Have I played Morrowind? I played Skyrim. I don't know if that counts. Oh boy, you guys are just listing stuff again. Power. Yeah, I mean, it's a power creep thing, but it's not just power creep. Often in power creep, the heroes are allowed to beat villains and then get new ones. But there are some stories that are just built around a central antagonist or threat, which basically means, like, you know, either the heroes need to build themselves up to the level where they can possibly hope to stand against this villain, or the villain and the heroes are getting stronger at, like, roughly the same rate, so it's an even match-ish. But if it's an even match, why do the heroes never win? You know, it's an annoying thing to have to balance. It's the needs of the plot versus what actually makes sense for the characters. The badass teacher trope is just the mentor trope. I have a video about that, so no need to worry about that. I've seen things about, like, Trope talks about, like, when gods fight each other. It's like, that's basically just the Godzilla threshold thing again. It's like, hey, what if we had these multiple, like, near omnipotent beings and we let them fight each other instead of the heroes doing anything? And it's like, well, that could be fun if you wrote it really well, but sometimes not. I've also seen a lot of possibly one person spamming. Don't do that. Trope talk about hero complexes, which is an interesting thing to explore. So the gist of a hero complex is that you have a character who basically feels like it is their responsibility to fix everything. And if things are wrong, it's because this hero has failed. You know how they wrote Adora and She-Ra? It's just that, basically. She gets over it at, like, I want to say the season 3 finale with the portal, where she's like, actually, Catra, maybe some of this is your fault. But it's an interesting thing to add to a hero because, like, you know, it's always a good question to ask, why is this hero doing heroics? Why are they a hero? And, you know, a lot of superheroes, it's like, oh, something bad happened, and they're like, let's make this never happen again. You know, you get your Bruce Waynes, you get your great power, great responsibilities. And really, in the great power, great responsibility one, that's just the hero complex boiled down to its most simple form. Like, you have power to make things better, so you absolutely must make things better. And when you expand this out, you end up with a character who essentially has no regard for their own well-being or mental health or actual physical limitations, because all they can focus on is, I have to make things better, I have to make things right. And this can produce a lot of fun angst, depending on how you explore it. And it can also just kind of, like... Sorry, someone brought up Superman in the chat, and he's an interesting example because, of course, he's got this bad, but also he's, like, so tough and powerful that it almost doesn't bother him because he actually can go and help people. Like, I've seen a few writers be like, hey, what if we let Superman, like, actually just solve world hunger and stuff? Like, what if he just did that? And it's like, okay, yeah, cool, let's do it. And, you know, you get some writers who are like, oh, but why didn't he do it earlier? And it's like, he's working on it, man. He's got a lot of weird stuff going on. But most of the time, characters with hero complexes are not actually physically capable enough to just do everything they want to do easily with no difficulty. Like, usually the hero complex is what kind of rips them apart, you know? They're constantly running themselves ragged. Batman is a good example of the way that typically works when they're doing it as a version of, like, he's pushing it to self-destructive extremes. Like, he absolutely has to make the world a better place. He's just one guy. He's not indestructible. He's not even particularly sturdy by superhero standards. Yes. I knew the Hero Academia people would be coming out in force for that one. And I will say that hero complex is not to be confused with hero syndrome, which is when you have a character who wants to be seen as a hero and causes crises to do this. You may recognize this as being literally the modus operandi of Syndrome from The Incredibles, whose name is a clever pun. Okay. Yeah, Spider-Man angst did get old real fast in the comics, in part because it was always the same angst. It's like, oh, I'm broke and sad, and everybody I love is dying or, you know, dead or whatever, and nobody can know my secret. Which is why, you know, you gotta really pace that stuff out. Like, people like reading Spider-Man because he's sincere and fun and quippy, not because he's miserable all the time, you know? Like, he can be miserable some of the time as a treat, but, you know. Hey, stop referencing my own characters in there. That's cheating. Let's see. I've seen the trope talk I know a guy thing pop up a couple times. Is like, I don't really know if there's much to say there. I guess the idea is that, like, you have a character who's like, we need to get this thing done, but don't worry, I know somebody who specializes in this thing. And this can be a way to introduce more protagonists. This can be a way to introduce secondary characters to rely on, or, you know, tertiary characters, side characters to betray them, maybe. It's just the fact that sometimes characters know characters. Like, there's nothing really there, you know? It's just a byproduct of the way that casts work. Ooh, hive minds. Boy, that's a weird one. I feel like I've seen fewer hive minds in recent media. I think they were really popular earlier, maybe when we didn't actually understand how, like, hive creatures kind of worked. I don't know if we know that now, but, like, the idea that, oh, everyone in a beehive is just, oh, it's a single part of a greater organism, sort of. It's like, no, they're all individual bees. They just do their jobs. It's not quite the same thing. But for a while, the idea of a hive mind was like the easiest way to justify an always chaotic evil race of aliens, basically. Like, that was the one thing people used it for. Because, you know, anything else is like, oh, these beings have free will. We can't possibly claim that they are all evil. But if they're a hive mind, we absolutely can. Oh, they're all drones. They just serve the will of the queen or something, or the whatever, the leader. And they're all evil because the leader is evil. And that's an easy way to do it. You know, it gives you an army of faceless disposable minions for your heroes to mow through very easily, and a big boss fight for them to deal with at the end. It's perfect. You know, it's a great stock set of bad guys. And I guess somewhere along the line, some spec-fic sci-fi writers were like, but what if we actually explored what it would be like to be a member of a hive mind? And people were like, huh? So I just haven't seen them used as much because it's like, they're old hat to use as villains so much because, like, well, here's the thing. There's like a gradient of how fun a villain is to watch. And smart, scary villains are very fun to watch. And cannon fodder villains are not fun to watch. And the problem with hive mind threats is that each individual bad guy, except for the leader queen thingy, is not a threat. You know, it might be a threat, but it's not an interesting threat. So in a world where power is essentially determined by narrative significance, a hive mind creature is completely devoid of actually being a problem. It's a conservation of ninjutsu problem. You got a threat that is just, on paper, it should be incredibly terrifying, but in practice, it's interchangeable faceless goons, and they don't even have individual personalities to make it more interesting. So they're just doomed. Knight of Cerebus. That's an interesting one. As I understand, that's named for, I think, a webcomic, Cerebus, that is known for having gotten way darker, kind of, not randomly, but, like, the story was going at a certain tone, and then suddenly it just, like, tanked in terms of, like, cheerfulness levels. So there are two tropes about this. One of them is Cerebus syndrome, which is when a story suddenly gets really dark. And another one is Knight of Cerebus, which is the one that was brought up, which is when you have a character whose arrival in the plot heralds that the story is about to get way worse. And sometimes this is... Sorry, when I say way worse, what I mean is way darker, not the quality is going to drop. So a Knight of Cerebus is often a villain who's way nastier than previously established villains. So, like, maybe the previous villains are, like, quippy or chill or not really all that bad. But then you get this new person... Excuse me. Someone is asking for a timeout, and who am I to deny them? Anyway, right, so basically you end up with these stories where a new character gets introduced, and the new character's like, I'm a super scary bad guy, I'm, like, really evil and stuff. And from that point forward, the entire rest of the story is running at a lower tone. Because, well, now there's, like, a new threat, like a really scary one. Or maybe the new threat doesn't even need to, like, survive very far past their intro. If they, like, force the heroes to do something they never wanted to do, or like foment, just unpleasantness between them. Again, to go back to She-Ra, from a certain point of view, this is the role that Double Trouble plays, because they do such a good job of like turning the heroes against each other and establishing the character wedge that drives Adora and Glimmer apart, and thus kind of causes almost all of the later interpersonal conflict in Season 4. So even though they're just like a chill, goofy shapeshifter chaos gremlin, they could be seen as a Knight of Cerberus because they introduce a level of conflict that the show kind of hadn't really done up until that point, where like the best friend squad power of friendship was pretty unassailable. Anyway, let's see. Trope talk, personality equals element. Oh, what is there to say? That's just a kind of... Basically, the gist there is that when you have a bunch of characters and like, an ensemble cast, it's generally expected that you will have a range of personalities among that cast. And if you give those characters superpowers related to, say, like the 4 classical elements, you're probably going to assign them based on those personalities. So it's like, oh, maybe for the hot-headed angry one, we'll give them fire powers, and maybe we'll give the flighty chill one wind powers, and the I don't know, the kind of normal one the water powers, and the boring one gets the earth powers. It's like, oh, it's genius. Nobody's ever thought of this before. I guess it's like, well, there's nothing wrong with playing to simplicity, and that's really what that is. It's like, what if I had a character who had a personality that you associate with a certain thing, and then also a connection to that thing? So like, I've got a spooky goth character, and they've got shadow powers. I've got an angry character, and they've got fire powers. Yeah, that they always do that. And it's like, you can play it up. You can do other stuff. You can have like, oh, this character has healing magic, and they're kind of an ass kicker, whatever. Or this character is a total hot-headed badass, but they're really stubborn, so actually they get to be an earth person like Toph, for instance. I guess it's like, this also feels like a trope where there's almost nothing to say. It's like, yeah, that sure is a thing that people do. I don't know. It doesn't make or break a story. It's a character trope. You can make almost any of those work. Trope talk, bad future. Ref sit my complaint about the multiverse from earlier in the stream. When you have a bad future episode, it almost always exists so that the characters can render it completely obsolete, which conveniently means that you can do whatever you want in the bad future and none of it matters because it's all going to get undone. So it's like, oh, we're going to go to the bad future where one of us is evil and the rest of us are dead, and oh no! And then at the end of the episode, they're like, well, let's make sure that never happens, and then it never happens. So the whole thing was kind of useless. I mean, it can be useful, and I'm not saying like, oh, just because it doesn't affect the main timeline means it doesn't matter, but like, a lot of those cases where they try and build stakes of like, oh, yeah, okay, we're in the bad future, but also if the bad guy breaks into the rebellion headquarters, it's all over. It's like, no, it's not. This whole timeline's about to be erased in like 10 minutes anyway. It doesn't matter what happens here. Like, we'll probably feel bad seeing our favorite characters get murked, but we know that they're going to be fine. The stakes of a bad future episode are typically non-existent, which is why it's basically just there to be a fun playground. And when the writers treat it like a fun playground, it can be a lot of fun. Or like, not necessarily, well, what you do sometimes have is like characters from the bad future come back with the main characters and start causing problems in the main timeline. And that can actually be a threat because it's back in the zone where the actual stakes exist. But mostly the bad future, it's like an alternate timeline episode. It exists to sort of insulate the plot from the effects of what actually happens in it. Trope talk, adult kid from the future. Now that is a way too specific trope that absolutely exists and could be talked about for a whole episode. I don't know why it's so, well, okay, I do know why it's so popular. An adult kid from the future is basically the ultimate reward for a romantic subplot. Like, you have your characters, and they're doing their will they won't they dance across 4 seasons of television, and then this mysterious new character shows up from the future, and like, hey guys, good news, you're gonna will they won't they your way into a relationship eventually, and this kid's gonna be the result. And it can be really fun. Like, I don't know if Indigo's watching this, but she'd probably have my head for this, because I've only seen 11 episodes of Sailor Moon total, but I know that they do this in Sailor Moon. I know they have, like, the little pink-haired girl who shows up is, like, their kid from the future. The example I'm more familiar with is obviously Trunks from Dragon Ball. And he's a funny case, because, like, like his existence and the fact that he's Vegeta and Bulma's kid, when he's introduced, I don't think Bulma and Vegeta have like spoken to each other, or at least like had more than one conversation. It's like, wow, that's gonna be really cool. I wonder how that's gonna happen. And then it's like nothing. It's a completely non-thing. Sorry, Ben 10 Omniverse, I literally just had to sit through this. Hell, did they do a kid from the future in Ben 10? That feels wrong. Anyway, so the kid from the future thing, it's like, hey, good news, your romantic subplot's gonna work out. You're gonna have an adorable kid. All the fanfic writers can go nuts about it. It'll be super fun. And that's kind of it. Like, you know, if you're not playing around with timelines or timelines getting erased, then the kid is fine. The kid will be totally safe, and you don't need to worry about like, oh, if I do anything wrong, maybe I'll stop existing. Like that can kind of add unnecessary stress. There was some. Hold on, someone brought up an example. I think. Oh yeah, Warhawk from Batman Beyond. That's a really funny case because so it's there's a crossover episode between Justice League and Batman Beyond, where Batman, Wonder Woman, and who else? Green Lantern, obviously, go to the future, and they end up in the Batman Beyond timeline with a little modification, which is great, because that means you get to have old Bruce Wayne and, like, regular Bruce Wayne hanging out with Terry. And I don't remember the exact context, but, like, he does a sassy little, hey, Batman, Bruce Wayne, Batman, have you met? And they both, in unison say, not now. And he said, oh, great, what do they used to call it? Stereo, and walks off. And I'm like, God, I would watch just, like, an entire show of this, but we only get one episode. And one of the characters there is a character named Warhawk, who is Green Lantern's son, and he's got wings, so he's clearly also Hawkgirl's kid, but like they can't quite admit it because Green Lantern and Hawkgirl are deep in the will they won't they at that time, and like Green Lantern asks him like, who's the mother, and he says, isn't it obvious? And Bruce is like, even if it is, leave it, because it's like he knows, somehow he knows that fucking with timelines never goes well. But anyway, in short, kid from the future can be fun, but also by its nature generally has to be sort of separate from the story because they're, you know, they imply a different story. They're essentially from a different story transplanted into the main one. As I understand it, the way they're doing that with Future Trunks and Dragon Ball now is they just fully erased his timeline because they were like, Future Trunks is objectively a better character than present Trunks. We can't just get rid of him. He's got to stick around. So now he's sticking around. I don't know. I don't mind it. Yeah, yes, person in chat, you do need to watch Batman Beyond. I'm sorry, you really want me to talk about the trope of evil being sexy and prudish being good? A trope I am thoroughly qualified to discuss? What is there to say about that? Oh, for ages and ages, sexuality's been vilified and seen as a monstrous, sinful thing, so obviously it's okay when villains do it and weird when heroes do it. Like, that's just like baked in, you know, baked in anxieties that have been sustained for hundreds of years at minimum. It's not good, but that's why it exists. Tragic backstories. That's like, we've talked about some weirdly specific tropes. I feel like tragic backstories is way too broad to be anything, you know? It's like, what is there to say? Oh, a character for whom bad things happened in their past. You mean all of them? No, I mean, you know, there's almost certainly something to say there. It's just like tragic backstories are such a... Almost everyone has something bad that's happened to them at some point. It's just, you know, when it gets a lot of highlighting and it's like, oh, this character, oh, they've been through so much, we're going to bring it up a lot. Then it turns into a tragic backstory and gets highlighted. And sometimes it can be overplayed. I guess that's the thing. Like, this is a trope that can be sort of overblown. And, like, especially if you have a character who's got, like, a reasonable grievance, but then, like, keeps coming back to it. Like, realistically, that is how a lot of that works. You know, people generally don't get over immediately formative bad things that happen to them. But in fiction, it's like, all right, I already know that the character's mom gets murdered. Do we have to keep flashing back to it? Oh, man. I don't know if this was just a thing in, like, early 90s anime. It might have been, like, a budget-saving thing, but they just keep doing flashbacks of the same scenes in case we missed it. And it never, ever worked out so well. Let's see. Why am I streaming so early in the morning? Time zones, baby. Trope talk, the Tom Bombadil? Is that a trope? That doesn't feel like a trope. That feels like one really weird thing that nobody knew what to do with, which is so funny to me. Like, most people rightly consider Lord of the Rings to be an absolute masterpiece, but it's very funny to me that almost everybody is like, but we don't talk about Tom Bombadil. Like, why the fuck would we? Like, what even is that? It's just like Tolkien made a beautifully perfect and fully woven together story, and he was like, and I'm also going to add a weirdo from, like, I don't know, another universe or something, and it'll be great. He'll just hang out and he'll willingly forswear the ring because he doesn't care about it. He's doing other stuff. And it's like, what? I don't know. I think it adds to a lot of the mystique of the world that it's like, yeah, sure, you know, it was sung into existence, but also, sometimes you get tourists, but oh, I don't know. I don't think most people are like, you know what my finely crafted, coherent fantasy world needs? Random people I don't explain that piss people off for decades. Maybe more fantasy writers should do that, actually. Trope talk, the heroes are already max level, example slayers. Yeah, that's an interesting one. It's a trope that I don't see very often because it's very difficult to pull off in any functional way. Because, of course, a lot of the way that stories work is by giving your heroes challenges to overcome and conflicts to solve. And if your hero is already as powerful as they're really going to get, it can be difficult to come up with threats for them to face that aren't just cartoonishly over the top and, like, you know, world-breaking. You know, this is, again, it's the Superman problem. It's like, well, there's nowhere for him to go, so we're going to have to throw a lot of stuff at him that all kind of works the same. And the way Slayers makes it work is just being like, yeah, okay, the main characters are so strong that basically no mortal threats can cause them problems. So they're dealing with, like, demon bureaucracy and, like, evil gods and extra-dimensional nightmare creatures and stuff like that. And they do a little bit of nerfing. Not really, like, nerfing. They explain it very strongly in the story. It makes sense. But basically the main character has a spell that is her, like, last resort spell in the first season that she uses to defeat an evil god, as mentioned, or I guess a demon lord or whatever, functionally an evil god. And then she learns after the fact that if she messes up that spell, it can fully destroy the entire world, and she has, like, a vision of what that would look like, and it really freaks her out. And then the entire thread in season 2 is the bad guy being like, I'm going to make you cast that evil spell that blows everything up. And she's like, oh no. Essentially, the threat of the season is not, oh no, it's a being too, well, it is a being too powerful for her to defeat, but it's more like the threat of the season is like, I'm going to make you use your ultimate attack and it'll wreck everything, which is a pretty good indicator of the power level the characters are working on, where the main threat is really themselves. But then in later seasons, they sort of unnerf it, as in she uses the spell a couple times. Like, they do, like, the cardinal sin of anime, where they bring back the same villain from season 1, like, way later. And then he does exactly the same thing he did in season 1. He releases the same big demon for them to kill, and they beat it the exact same way. And I was like, well, the animation's prettier, but I was kind of hoping you'd come up with something else this time. Anyway, but yeah, it's a good show, but it's one of the only ones I've seen that pulled off the max-leveled characters from the start thing well. And even then, it's a little shaky in places. So, let's see. Oh, God, heroes with bad publicity. Talk about a trope I hate. There's nothing inherently wrong with it, except that sometimes it requires the characters to be very, very stupid. And that can be frustrating. The trope of the hero with bad publicity is where the hero is trying their best to save the world and, you know, fix everything, but everybody hates them. This is a very classic thing for Spider-Man. You know, your J. Jonah Jameson types. They did this in Danny Phantom. It's like, oh, you know, our hero is hated and misunderstood. You know, Drizzt again. Our hero is hated and misunderstood, and everything is terrible, and they never get rewarded for trying to save the day because everybody hates them. And so often, this relies entirely on the characters being dumb and easily duped. Like, the villain will be like, aha, I'm going to tell the whole world that you were the one who had this evil plan that has my fingerprints all over it. And the hero's like, no way. And then everyone's like, oh my God, I can't believe the hero of our city totally did this evil thing. And it's like, Fucking really, guys? Really? Like, there's something very rewarding about stories where the characters act like real human beings and actually think sometimes. One of the things I actually really liked about Arcane is that they sort of avoided all the shortcuts to easy conflict between the characters. Like, the thing about Arcane is that almost all of the characters, just by the virtue of League of Legends lore, has like a nemesis that they are destined to fight forever. And a lot of them start off that show best friends with that nemesis. Like, Jace and Victor are screwed. They are going to become nemesis. Jinx and Vi and Caitlyn, well, I mean, Vi and Caitlyn are destined to be besties, but Jinx and Caitlyn and Jinx and Vi are destined to be on opposite sides. And there were so many times where I was like, okay, they're going to do the misunderstanding plot. Okay, they're going to do the, oh, you said a mean thing to me once and now I hate you forever. And then they just don't do that. Like, they go out of their way to be like, look, yeah, that sucked and it was really bad, but like, you know, we're still sisters. Nothing is going to change that, stuff like that. And, you know, people would talk through their problems, which ended up making it seem like the inevitable breakdown of their relationship is going to be grounded in actually unsolvable problems, things that aren't idiot plots, things that don't rely on the characters being stupid and terrible at communicating. The problem is the hero with bad publicity trope kind of relies on this because the hero is a hero. They are doing heroic things. They are trying to save the day. In order to have bad publicity, they need to have either done something genuinely bad that people are mad at them about, or they need to be constantly being framed for stuff, or like their public image needs to be smeared. And that relies on everybody being so stupid, and it can be incredibly frustrating to watch. So it's like, especially with Spider-Man. I mean, fun fact, I have not watched Spider-Man No Way Home. I probably will someday. It's just they started from a premise I hate, and then they added the friggin' multiverse, which at this point is my personal nemesis. And by the end, it's like, congratulations, we reset to the Peter Parker we probably should have given you from the beginning. And I'm like, good, I'll watch the next movie where you actually use that Peter Parker. Anyway, I hate this trope so much. And, like, the funny thing is, I like the stories where the heroes are like, oh, the world isn't ready to know about us, and that's why we have bad publicity. It's like, you know, you're like your Ninja Turtles, your X-Men, even your Gargoyles, where it's like, people will think we're monsters, so we're going to hide. The problem is in those stories, when they do go public, and then people are like, monsters, and then they get mad about it, and I'm like, oh, these people are so dumb, and it's annoying to watch. It's, as mentioned, X-Men Evolution is great, but they have an arc after the mutant's existence is revealed to the world, and I find it very frustrating to the point where I don't think I've rewatched it since I first watched the show, because it's just like, hey, you know what I really want to see for all my main characters who have all these complex interpersonal issues and interesting things we could explore? I really want to see Joe random person on the street yelling slurs at them. That sounds like fun. It's like it completely flattens the story down to just people hate them and won't listen. And it's so interesting. I love seeing that everybody hates this character who deserves all the nice things in life. Boy, how long have I been ranting about this? That's an oddly specific one. The thing about green gore is good gore, as in, like, it's okay to show, like, kind of, like, R-rated violence as long as the blood's a weird color. I mean, that's just a byproduct of forms of censorship, I assume, / the fact that, like, we have a slightly visceral response to, like, oh, that looks like human blood. That makes me freaked out. Whereas it's like, oh, that's green. Whatever bled that probably isn't friendly. Wow, okay, you guys are really flying. Trope Talk comic relief is, I think, too big for an individual thing. Because it's like, yeah, sometimes in a story, you need someone who's funny. Subtropes of it, like Crouching More and Hidden Badass, where it's like, this character is a comic relief character, but also they can do things sometimes. It's pretty fun. Oh god, Trope Talk Heroes on Trial. How is that any different than Heroes with Bad Publicity? It's the exact same frustration. It's the same level of, like, if you used your brain, this wouldn't be an issue. It just annoys me so much. It's like, it's a contrived threat that's based entirely on the premise that the characters are at the mercy of a bunch of dumb people who won't listen to them. And that's, like, my nightmare, so I don't know. Maybe I just have personal beef with it. Trope Talk. Unreliable narrator. Boy, that's a complicated one. The problem is, when you break down that trope, you just find fundamental principles of writing rather than individual narrative choices. A thing that a lot of people don't really pay attention to, because it's not really a way that writing is taught, is that every story that has narration, which is, most of them, like, not necessarily comics, but, like, pretty much all books, has a narrative voice, and thus an implied narrator. And sometimes that narrator is an actual character. Some stories will kind of play with that. Harrow the Ninth has a plot twist hidden in who's narrating the story. Because, every story that's being narrated has a narrative voice. Sometimes it's sort of the voice of the writer. Sometimes it's the voice of an implied, impassive, perhaps slightly amused observer. Most of the Discworld books are either basically being narrated by... Discworld books are rarely narrated by a character, but they are often narrated by, like, a vaguely, like, dry, sense of humored, omniscient character who seems to be hovering around in the head of one character. So we will get a look into the thoughts of only that character, and we will see their observations of other characters through this sort of wry narrative voice. Basically, every story has an implied narrator. In a story with an unreliable narrator, that implied narrator is generally locked in as an actual character physically present in the story, and they are not recounting the objective truth of the situation. The problem is, if you break down that definition far enough, that is all narrators. There's no such thing as an objective truth in something as subjective as storytelling. So, from a certain point of view, all narrators are unreliable, but what that really means is that there's a gradient of narrator unreliability. Above a certain point, we consider a narrator to be unreliable. And usually that's when the character is a character present in the story who is actively trying to mislead the audience. Classic example I've used before, the murder of Roger Ackroyd. There's a bit at the beginning where the narrator is like, I gave this letter to Roger Ackroyd. 10 minutes later, I left him. What they don't tell you is that within those 10 minutes, they murder Roger Ackroyd. That is what we would consider an unreliable narrator. We would probably expect a narrator to tell us, hey, this guy died. But some narrators kind of mess with you, especially in Discworld. A lot of times the tone of the narration kind of means that the order of operations of certain information being revealed is maybe a little bit, like, out from what you might expect. Like, hey, should I mention that this character is an 8-foot-tall skeleton? No, I'll just mention that he's got, like, a slight tone to his voice that makes him seem a little bit nervous today, which is fine. That's part of the tone of the story. And a lot of the best stories I've read come from writers who recognize and acknowledge that even an omniscient third-person perspective narrator has a narrative voice that they can mess with. Let me drink my second sip of tea for the night. Excuse me. Oh god, trope talk liar revealed. Speaking of tropes I hate because they require characters to be stupid. The liar revealed trope is frustrating in a lot of ways, and it's not as blatantly these characters are just being dumb as, like, the hero with bad publicity one is. Sorry, my chair is just a little squeaky. It's not supposed to be. It's for recording music, but what are you going to do? Anyway, the trope of the liar revealed, the gist of it, for those of you who aren't aware, is that you have a character in a story who has been concealing information or living some sort of lie. And they probably have friends and allies and stuff who know them within the confines of this lie. They know this false version of them. And as the story progresses, this character becomes more and more insecure and guilty about the fact that they are lying to these people who care about and trust them, until eventually either they reveal the truth or the truth is revealed against their will. And usually this leads to the friends be like, guys, it's not a cat, it's my chair squeaking. I wish it was a cat. Anyway, although admittedly I was editing some audio I recorded in here at one point, and I also was like, why is there a cat? So anyway, the problem with the liar revealed trope is it is difficult to do in a manner that is not frustrating. It's usually steeped in dramatic irony. Usually the audience can tell early on where this story is going to go. That, like, okay, you have a character who's living a lie. They are going to eventually be revealed. And it is almost always going to be not under their control. I think the only cartoon I've ever seen that, like, didn't quite do that was actually the first season of Young Justice, where, like, I think, like, by the finale, almost every character has some secret they're keeping from the rest of the group. No way, I think it's not almost all of them, but it's like more than half of them. I remember because there's a great bit from Kid Flash, like they're like 2 character reveals deep, and he's like, all right, anyone else have any like horrifying revelations? And one of them's like, I do, and he says, I swear I was kidding. So it can be funny, but that show worked because the characters did the smart thing. They were like, look, I know this might change the way you see me, but I'm being blackmailed by bad guys using this information, so here is that information. And they're like, okay, cool, thanks for telling me. I trust you more now. But then you get stories where it's like, hey, what's up? I've been lying to you guys and I did this thing, and everyone's like, oh, how could you do this to me? I'm going to hold that against you forever, even though you tried to make it better. And that is within their right, but it can still be frustrating. I'm glad other people have such affection for Young Justice Season 1. I should probably just rewatch that. I got so mad that the later seasons weren't doing anything I liked that I just haven't revisited the first season, but I remember really enjoying it, so... Oh, what kind of tea? It's delicious peppermint tea, so very nice. Oh, Kenobi's happening in 30 minutes? Well, I wouldn't want to keep you guys from that. Trope Talk Fetch Quest? Is that really appreciably different than the Trope Talk on MacGuffins? Slash the Trope Talk on Ancient Artifacts? I guess it's not quite similar. The gist of a fetch quest is, oh, our heroes are tasked with going and grabbing a thing, and it'll probably take them through some interesting set pieces along the way. This actually reminds me, I had an interesting ask about this on the comic Tumblr like a few days ago, where someone was telling me like, hey, look, whenever I write, I have a super easy time coming up with characters and like fun little scenes and moments, but I can't think of central plots to save my life. What do I do? And I was like writing out this response, and I sort of ended up concluding that in a lot of cases, the central plot is by its nature incredibly simple, because all it exists to do is propel the heroes forward. It's just a velocity vector, you know, speed and direction. And that's why, you know, in a lot of stories, it's like a character wants to get home, wants to solve a mystery, wants to rescue their friend. Those are all very simple things. It's the set pieces that takes them through and the characters they meet that makes the story actually interesting. It's like, you know, you do a train trip by following the tracks, but you're not paying attention to the tracks, you're paying attention to the stuff out the window and the people you meet along the way. And in this case, the fetch quest trope is an incredibly simple core plot, but that doesn't mean it makes for a boring story, because the interest level of the story is based kind of on like the execution, not the way it summarizes on paper. So the gist of a fetch quest is our heroes have to get the thing or the things, you know, the MacGuffin or the set of MacGuffins, and that's it. And then after that, you know, all kinds of interesting stuff can happen. Darkest Hour. I already have a video on the Darkest Hour trope. You could just watch that. Let's see. Trope Talk, homoerotic undertones. Is that a real, like, is that a real thing? Is that like a thing that I can actually discuss, or is that just, how much are the fans reading into this? There's like a whole muddy space. Like there's a Venn diagram with completely fuzzy borders between like queer baiting and queer coding, and the fans are maybe reading something into that I don't think is there, but oh, I don't know. So many things. Oh wow, you guys are just flying along with new ones. Trope Talk gender bending? What is that? I guess there is something to say with that. Maybe not something I'm qualified to make a whole video on. As I understand it, the trope of gender bending has been re-examined in recent years and is perhaps slightly more, shall we say, problematic than it was initially believed, because obviously there's overlap between it and things like, you know, trans experiences, but maybe it's a little bit weird about it. A lot of gender bending stories are like, what? I've swapped genders and everything about me is completely different and I adhere to so many stereotypes now. And that's like, I don't really think that is good. I don't know. But then you also get stories where it's like, hey, I'm going to play with the gender bending concept, and like, you know, all the like closeted queer kids reading it who don't even necessarily know this about themselves yet are like, wow, this is really resonating with me for some reason. Which is it's an interesting phenomenon, I guess. I mean, you know, we've talked about this before, how like in the queer-coded villains trope talk, where a lot of these characters that are objectively like not intended to be good representation. They are intended to be evil villains framed as extra depraved. But then, if you're a kid and you've never ever seen yourself reflected in fiction, and then you see this absolutely fabulous supervillain, you're like, I like that one. And a lot of times our best experiences come from writing that is not intended to be particularly good for us. I think I mentioned last time that like Ranma 1/2 has not aged well, but boy, it hits interestingly for a lot of people I know, and it doesn't even necessarily need to be like a specifically gender thing. Like I am a cis woman. I have never had any trouble identifying with that, but I absolutely loved Ranma because girl Ranma had basically my personality, and I was like, wow, is it okay to kind of be like an ass-kicking, tank top-wearing badass and also a pretty girl? And, I don't know. It was such a baffling thing for me to get out of that. But I know a lot of people who got completely other things out of that manga from very similar sources. So, you never really know what's going to resonate. And I think a lot of times when people are analyzing this, it's easy to just be like, you see, this is bad and harmful and should never happen. And it's like, well, if it never happened, a lot of people would be missing out on some pretty fun formative experiences. Like, just because it hasn't held up doesn't mean it didn't do good when it existed. Let's see. Trope Talk Sonic the Hedgehog OCs? Now you're really reaching, buddy. That's not a trope. And even if it were, I would not be qualified to discuss it. Oh, boy. Sorry, a lot of interesting ones here. And also Trope Talk harems. What do you want me to say about that? Hey, some people have a power fantasy where they're swarmed by beautiful people of their preferred gender who absolutely want to jump their bones. Shocker. I don't know. Let's see. Back-to-back comments. Trope Talk the Scrappy and Trope Talk the Wesley. Are those appreciably different concepts? The Scrappy is, of course, basically the equivalent of Scrappy-Doo. A child. Is Scrappy a puppy? It's a little odd for him to be a puppy considering his voice is a whole adult man. A kid character added to a show with an already extant ensemble cast solely for the purposes of adding like kid appeal or, fun youth stuff, or just, hey, you know what we need? A cute mascot. Whereas the Wesley is a young character added to a show to be like a precocious young genius who also gets that youth demographic. But in both cases, everybody hates them. Which I think is thoroughly unfair. Wesley Crusher is not the worst character in Star Trek, especially not those early seasons. My conspiracy theory is that Wesley Crusher was so hated precisely because he was designed to be the projection character that the target audience of the show could see and be like, that's me! I could be there. A young, smart, scientifically minded kid, exactly the kind of guy who'd be watching Star Trek The Next Generation as a young person. But those kids don't want to see themselves in Wesley. They want to see themselves in Riker and Picard, and some of them as Geordi and Data, it turns out. But they didn't expect that, They clearly didn't. So what you end up with is a character who's designed to be projected onto, but he's not a flattering reflection of that character archetype. He's kind of a smart aleck, but he also kind of doesn't really know what's happening. And he's not as experienced as his co-workers, his like mentors and parent and stuff like that. And he ends up just sort of painting an unflattering reflection of what the writers thought their target audience looked like, when the target audience wanted to be like, yeah, I want to be like Riker. He's badass and handsome, and he always smooches them alien babes. And it's like, oh, I want to be Data. He's super strong and nice and neurodivergent, and, stuff like that. So, in almost any fictional story where a character is designed to be projected on, there's like 50-50 odds that character is going to be the subject of absolute loathing instead. I feel the same way about Gohan. That's an interesting point, actually. I feel like, yeah, it's similar. Kind of like, hey, we're adding a character who's sort of trying to recapture like the original child demographic for the new generation. Because, of course, Goku aged up, and poor Toriyama, he kept trying to like deprecate Goku and let Gohan be the main character, but he couldn't let go. Let's see. I hate to tell you this, one person commenting, but Chicago is not a trope. See, okay, the person saying, like, Wesley was hated because he was atrociously written. The thing is, I've recently watched all those seasons that have Wesley in them, and he's not worse written than anyone else in those early episodes. He's not worse written than Deanna Troi, certainly. He's, like, written to be the precocious genius who will someday transcend everyone's expectations, but until then, he's not ready yet. He's not even particularly poorly acted compared to some of those guys. Like, those early episodes, those scripts weren't doing anyone any favors. The only reason that show was watchable is because Patrick Stewart can make anything sound good, and everyone else was sort of like picking up on the acting waves that were coming off of him. Basically what I'm saying is that Wesley Crusher gets a lot of unnecessary hatred and flack, considering he's not that much worse than the rest of the show, and I think a lot of it is just because, like, people were subtly picking up on the vibes that Wesley was supposed to be them. Trope Talk Riker not sitting in chairs normally. Jonathan Frakes had a back injury he didn't want to exacerbate. That's the thing. That's all. Sympathetic villains. We talked about villain protagonists earlier. Sympathetic villains aren't quite the same thing. That's when you have a villain who the audience is expected to understand, sympathize with. You know, sympathizing with a character can mean a lot of different things. It usually doesn't mean, oh, I condone everything they do and I think that they've never done anything wrong, but it can mean that. Sympathetic characters in general, well, I mean, that's just kind of the space of almost all character writing. Like, you can write unsympathetic characters, even on purpose sometimes, but there's not a whole lot to say there. Like, a lot of the goals of character writing is to produce characters that are sympathized with, you know, like with relatable motivations and backstories and stuff like that. The purpose of making a sympathetic villain is to produce a certain amount of cognitive dissonance in the audience, to see a character who, by their position in the story and their actions and motive, is a bad guy, and then frame them in a way that makes us be like, oh yeah, they're bad, but like, I kind of get it, you know, I kind of want them to succeed, but I also kind of don't. And honestly, this one's it's really hit or miss. Because a lot of times, the way they do it is they're like, this villain is making only good points, but also they're threatening this busload of kittens and must be put down, and we will never ever address the actual good points they're making. And that's a way to make a sympathetic villain that you probably should have written differently. Because it's like, look, either acknowledge the actual good points they're making and have that affect the story, or don't give them an actual good point in the first place. All right, let's see. Wow, you guys are just firing away. Okay, I've seen a lot of the Trope Talk Shut Up Hannibal, which I feel like needs some explanation for those of you who don't spend all your time on TV tropes. The gist is that there is a trope called the Hannibal Lecture, which is when you have a character, usually a villain, giving a speech about how, like, not just everything sucks, and not just, oh, the character that's fighting you sucks, but like, oh, you know, like, reality itself is depressing or whatever. Basically, it's when the villain has a speech, the purpose of which is to be like, I'm so much smarter than you, and I understand the way the world really works, and that's why I'm evil, and you're a loser. The Shut Up Hannibal trope is when a character basically says, you're wrong and also stupid, and shuts him down. It is wildly dependent on the quality of the actual writing of the speech, because some of those villains are just like pulling concepts out of their ass, and the hero being like, that's just objectively not true, is barely a revelation. And sometimes you have a villain who's making a legitimately good point, and then the hero's like, but have you considered, I don't care, which can be fun and can be annoying. So so many of these tropes are like, if you write them well, they can work. If you write them badly, they might not. Aizen. Oh, God. Don't make me remember trying to watch Bleach, please. I've seen the Trope Talk on Undying Loyalty pop up, and I'm also not really sure what to talk about there, because it's like, yeah, sometimes you have characters that are really, really loyal to other characters. That's a thing that happens. It's one way to write a relationship between two characters. It's not that complicated. Let's see. Oh boy, it's flying along again. Sorry. Oh no, when I get quiet, you guys fill the chat, and then it's harder for me to read the chat. Trope talk olive bleach. Somehow you're not going to get me that easily. Good grief. All right, you guys are going to need to reach some kind of consensus. This is so funny. It's only getting worse. Okay. All right. I already talked about Godzilla Threshold. I fully have a video about redemption arcs, I think. No, wait. Maybe I just have a thing about villains. Whatever. It's somewhere out there. Good God. Legacy characters? I feel like I've talked about that before. Oh, yes. Drinking some tea. That's a great idea. Ooh, I saw one about the Starscream, which will give me a good example to talk about Transformers. Okay. So, the gist of the Starscream is obviously based on the character Starscream. The Starscream, as a character archetype, is like the villain's like treacherous lieutenant. So the thing is, the villain's lieutenant is typically called the Dragon. These are characters who are like the right-hand man, but for the bad guy. So, you know, Darth Vader to Palpatine, preceded by Darth Maul to Palpatine, / Dooku to Palpatine. He really goes through those guys fast. The Starscream is when the villain has a right-hand man who is not loyal, who's like always trying to get their evil promotion or, supplant the bad guy, become the main bad guy. The problem with writing a Starscream, especially when the Starscream is, in fact, Starscream, is that, like, why does the villain keep them around? That is the ultimate question at the heart of the Starscream. Why does the villain keep them around? If they are constantly trying to backstab them, thwart their plans, supplant them, overthrow them, why does the villain keep them around? And there are a few explanations. This is not an unsolvable problem, but it can be tricky to find an explanation that does not make the villain look stupid, which is, again, the issue. So the one common explanation to really make the villain seem more badass is that they are completely confident that the Starscream cannot do anything to hurt them, and they keep them around to kind of just show that off. It's like, yeah, they're constantly trying to beat me up, but, like, it doesn't actually do anything, and it's pretty hilarious, so whatever. You also get cases where the villain doesn't seem to realize that their advisor is treacherous, which is unfortunately in the category of the villain seems dumb and thus less effective because of this. I think the version they did it in, the way they did it in Transformers Prime, I remember working quite well. And I think the general gist there is that basically after a while of Starscream doing his Starscreamy scheming, say that 5 times fast, is that basically Megatron is like, Starscream, I know you're constantly trying to betray me, and frankly, I'm getting pretty sick of it, so get out, and, like, beats the shit out of him, and Starscream, like, runs away and barely escapes with his life and is like, all right, fine, I'm going to become Starscream, ally to no one. That's totally different from how I was before. And Starscream does eventually get back into Megatron's good graces, but, like, does so in such a traumatic way to himself that, like, he genuinely doesn't try betraying him again in that show. So it really just kind of makes Megatron seem more intimidating that he actually got Starscream to stop Starscreaming, which is pretty impressive. All right, you better stop spamming that Trope Talk montage. It's not going to work. All right. Okay, let's see. Oh, yes, another thing about the Starscream is frequently incompetent. The thing is, when the bad guy has like a loyal lieutenant, they are often there because they are very good at what they do. When they have a disloyal lieutenant, it is usually because the villain does not think that this disloyal lieutenant can actually pose them a threat. Usually that means they are not that competent. The way it works in Transformers Prime is that Megatron has like 5 or 6 second-in-commands at various different times, and like, obviously Starscream is, the Starscream, but the one that's the most reliable is Soundwave, who everyone agrees is the fucking coolest Transformer ever. They gave him like a much better redesign. He no longer has the tape deck that turns into a cat. Anyway, and he also, like, I think, what is it? Shockwave, I think? The purple one. He shows up later too, and Arachnid tries to be the Starscream, but she's not very good at it, so Anyway, my point is, like, a big chain of command. Oh, he's got Predaking for a while, who's a dragon transformer. You guys should watch this show. It's actually really good. But yeah, for a while, he's got Predaking as his second in command. And then he's like, uh-oh, this guy might actually be scarier than me. I should probably betray him in a way that he'll never find out. And you're never going to believe what he does near the finale. Anyway, let's see. What the... Humans are Cthulhu? Oh, this is probably one of those humans or space orcs things. So, as I understand it, and I might not be getting this definition right, the gist is that there are some stories that frame humans as the existential eldritch horror that is incomprehensible to the audience or the characters in the story. It's a fun little, like, perspective twist. Plenty of stories get a lot of mileage out of being written from an unusual perspective you may or may not be able to guess early on. It's kind of a Twilight Zone thing. But there's also the subgenre that has been affectionately named humans or space orcs, which is essentially just highlighting that there are things about our species that perhaps if we went to space and found another intelligent life, we would realize were weird or, like, interesting and unique about us. The fact that Earth is such a weirdly hostile environment, if you break it down into its component parts, kind of, you know, there's a trope, Earth is Space Australia, which is essentially that Earth is the weirdly, terrifyingly deadly hell world that people were like, there can't possibly be life on that planet. It's one giant biomass gray goo scenario. And then it's like, I don't know, sir. They seem to be forming bipedal shapes. So anyway, it's a fun little bit of like spec fic. It essentially reframes humanity through an alien perspective, and you can get a lot of mileage out of writing stories from that. But yeah, you know, it's interesting. It's another trope that kind of shapes the entire story, because it's sort of foundational to the way that it's told, which there's nothing wrong with that. Again, lots of stories are like that, but like a lot of these tropes are sort of like pick and choose, you know, you pick them off the shelf, you find a way to make them fit. But some of these are things that have to be foundational to the story, and I think the humans or space orcs angle is pretty deep in there. Trope talk, self-insert. Oh boy. I mean, I already did a video on Mary Sue's so long ago. But, you know, self-inserts are complicated because there's kind of a gradient there, you know? Like, most writers I know are of the opinion that it is very difficult to write a character that has none of you in it. So from a certain perspective, you could argue that most characters are kind of self-inserts, but the fact is, I actually think it's quite different to write a character drawing on your personal experience and the way your mind works versus drawing a character who you want to be you. Because one of those is easier to mess up. Writing a character who you want to be you is a very complicated process because most of us don't have a particularly accurate self-image. Which is just how it works. We're really not good at looking at ourselves. We're very good at looking at other people and judging them. But when we look at ourselves, there's all kinds of stuff in the way. It's just very difficult to do. So if you write a character and you're like, this character is me, typically that character is going to be a mix of things that you idealize about yourself that may or may not be true, and things that you hate about yourself that may or may not be true. Because the actual observation of who you are as a person and how you work is not gonna look like you to you, you know? But then if you build a character out of your personal experience, you can end up with a character who is quite similar to you in the way they function, but isn't you but in the story. So essentially, you know, in a lot of cases, the goal of the self-insert is essentially escapism. You know, you put a copy of you in a fun world, and then you have all kinds of cool stuff happen to that character. And that's a way to make it work. And there's nothing wrong with escapism. I'm not going to sass people for doing that. But the reason why it can be difficult for anybody else to get anything out of reading it is because it's really hard to write a self-insert that anybody else will like, because of the blind spot problem. When you are writing somebody who you think of as you, basically there's going to be things that you assume to be true about yourself, things that show through in your writing about yourself that maybe look really obvious to an outside perspective, but you don't notice because of blind spots about yourself. The thing is, even people who are really good at analyzing and understanding other people can have massive blind spots about themselves. We think of ourselves differently than we think about anybody else. We can have all kinds of baggage tangled up in who we are versus how we see everybody else. You know, most of us have some kind of double standard between how we treat ourselves and how we treat anybody else. And when you are trying to write a self-insert, you end up with a character who looks like how you think you look or how you wish you looked. And those will probably be completely unrecognizable to anybody who knows you as being supposed to be you. Trope talk, drink more tea. All right, I get it. I'm working on it. So, you know, sometimes when you're reading a story, you can really tell, like, oh man, this isn't even specific to self-inserts, but sometimes when you're reading a story, you can tell, like, when an author is, like, really insecure about something or weirdly hung up on something or trying very hard to justify how something is totally normal and not at all weird to put in your story. And there's a level of insecurity there that can shine through and just be visible. What was it? There was I was watching one of those like Jenny Nicholson book reviews about it. I just don't remember the book. It was one of those laughably terrible ones. And for some ungodly reason, every single character in the book commented on how big the main character was, like height-wise. It wasn't an NSFW thing. It was just like, wow, you're a big guy, aren't you? You must be at least 6'6". And it's like, oh my God. Like, you don't bring that up that many times if it's something you're completely secure about, you know? I don't know. It's just interesting. And when you're writing a self-insert, it's very hard to avoid those things. And there's nothing wrong with having, like, insecurities about that. Excuse me. All right. The one person spamming who wants to go to bed, I will indulge you just this once. But for the record, notice me red pie is not a good way to get this to work in the long run. Anyway, the thing you requested about idiotic villains like Team Rocket, they can be good for a laugh, but if they don't have any deeper characterization, that's kind of all they're good for. And like most comic relief tropes that go nowhere, it was not the Raylo book, it was a different book. I remember that much. Yeah, you're right, it was Trigger Warning. Oh my God, I'd forgotten. I knew the title was something really stupid, but it didn't narrow it down. Anyway, hilariously ineffective villains can be funny, but like most things, if they're only funny, I find that they don't tend to add that much to the story, which is fine. Again, this is why I like the Crouching More and Hidden Badass. It's a character who looks like they're just funny, but then they have something deeper under the surface. I don't know. I was never a Pokemon kid. I don't know if Team Rocket got interesting later. Anyway, self-inserts. They're very complicated. I feel like it's a losing battle. Like, there's nothing wrong with writing them and having fun with it, but it really does feel like if you're writing anything for the consumption by anybody else, probably best to avoid it just because it adds so many unnecessary complications, you know? But on the other hand, writing characters that draw from your personal experiences that's a very different experience than writing a self-insert. Even though it sounds like on paper they should be exactly the same. You're writing a character from your life experience. That's how writing characters is supposed to work most of the time. Because it allows you to get inside their head very easily and understand how they think and expand it out. And sometimes it lets you work through some stuff through this character. Like, as mentioned, we have a double standard between how we treat ourselves and how we treat other people. And sometimes that means if we externalize what we're struggling with into somebody else and approach them from like a compassionate perspective, sometimes it can be easier to unravel things that were bothering us and maybe find ways that we can deal with them. I think Noel Stevenson mentioned this about how they'd written Catra as like they'd put in some not unpacked stuff into this character, and then they saw all these people online like just fully unpacking casually all the psychological stuff going on, and they were like, oh no. So anyway, interesting stuff. I think that the impulse to write a self-insert is because, you know, especially when you're early on writing, when you're very excited, and when you're having a lot of fun playing around with this cool world, the temptation to just put yourself into it, very strong, because it's a cool world. You want to play around in it. And, like, you can either do the thing where you're, like, tonking action figures together, or you can do the one where you're like, this is me. I'm this Barbie, and I'm having a great time in this universe, and there's nothing wrong with it. You know, ultimately, the creative process is fun, and that's kind of how it works. And if you're having fun, I'm not going to complain. But if you're creating media for anybody else to consume, and thus quality is a consideration, self-inserts tend to be more trouble than they're worth. Not to say that you can't have a character that started off as a self-insert and got more complicated, or a character that you initially intended to not be a self-insert and then was like, oopsies, I put like 90% of my fundamental workings in this. Anyway, I should probably switch cons. Let's see. Trope talk, you killed my father. I mean, it's a very stock hero motivation, you know? Like, lots of heroes need a reason, you know, a kick in the butt to get them out of the door. And for efficiency purposes, if the character that's keeping your hero from doing heroics is a stern yet fair father figure, and also the hero's not sure about going out into the world and doing the cool heroic stuff and meeting all the characters you have designed, you can kind of kill two birds with one stone by icing the father figure and then being like, oh no, that guy iced your father figure. You should totally go and get revenge. You know, it's just it's just optimization, man. You know, we can double up the memory usage. Found Family, I think, deserves an actual trope talk on its own. I'm just not really sure. I worry that trope is too enormous. It's almost like, hey, we're going to cover the entire space of complex interpersonal platonic bonds of friendship and camaraderie and love. And we're going to call it Found Family, and that's going to be it. And it's like, but that's so many different things. Okay, the thing about anti-heroes is I actually have a video about that, and it has charts and everything. So we're not going to do that here, because this is the lightning round. But, yeah, that video exists. The Final Girl. See, that's a horror-specific trope, and I don't do horror very much because it freaks me out. Let's see. Evil sounds deep. You really want me to talk about the trope where, hey, we have a villain, let's give him a sweet, bassy baritone voice? Like, what is there to talk about? It's kind of, you know, hey, what if we have a bad guy and we gave him a really cool-sounding, resonant voice? Like, it's not even like an unfair stereotype because there are plenty of deep-voiced protagonists, or at least some. I don't know. Some of these tropes, I'm like, do you really want me to talk about this, or do you just want me to acknowledge that I saw your comment? Badass normal. That is the trope for when you have a character who is an ordinary human and a badass. Typically in contrast with characters who are superhuman in some way. So Batman is the badass normal of the Justice League because everybody else has superpowers or magical artifacts or, you know, whatever. Wings that one time. This essentially allows you to highlight, oh, this character, they can keep up with the superpowered types even though they're totally normal because they're just that good. Sometimes it can sort of tip over the... Again, this is a trope that works if you write it well and not if you don't write it well. Because sometimes it can sort of tip over the edge into being like, oh, this character is so cartoonishly good at everything that it makes their superpowered peers seem completely inept in contrast. Why does that happen? All right, let's see. I'm going to say we're probably going to want to wind down in the next 10 minutes or so, just so I don't wipe out my voice, and also so that you guys can sleep. Let's see. Is Batman really that normal? By the standards of the Justice League, Batman is downright sedate, okay? He's completely normal. He doesn't have any superpowers, wasn't chosen by any magic interdimensional rings. Sacrificial lamb character. Okay, we talked about the sacrificial lion. The sacrificial lamb, I'm guessing, is the character who's like sweet and innocent and exists to die. Which makes sense. You know, sometimes you need a tragic backstory. Sometimes you need somebody to motivate you. Those are really the same thing. Similar to the Redshirt, if they exist to die, they're probably not going to be super complicated or developed. But unlike the Redshirt, this is a character who exists to twist the knife, so they will get just enough development to make them likable and lovable, and then they die. So that's unfortunate. Oh boy. Okay, let's see. Corruption arcs. Oh boy. I feel like we talked about this in its own video. That's what we have fallen heroes for. But I guess corruption arcs imply something a little bit longer term than a fallen hero. Like, they end with the hero falling to the dark side, but like typically in a corruption arc, you know, Anakin style, we see them getting worse over time. I say Anakin style. That's not really how Anakin works. Like, theoretically, that's how it works, But in practice, he's like pretty much evil from minute one. It's so funny. In those movies, anytime he has the opportunity to do anything evil, he will do the evil thing. Trope Talk Alien Invasion. Stay tuned. I actually have a thing about that coming out soon-ish. The brick joke. Okay, so for those of you who don't know and can't infer from the title because the title tells you nothing, a brick joke is when a thing that was dropped earlier comes back around in a funny way. So, like, a character throws a brick into the air, and it just doesn't come down. And then, like, 40 minutes later, a character's minding their own business, and then the brick hits him in the head. Brick joke. Essentially, it's when you do planting and payoff with a large gap in between. You plant a concept, and then you pay it off. It's like a Chekhov's gun, but for humor. It can be very funny. It's a comedy trope, which means it generally doesn't add that much tangible stuff to the story, but it is pretty fun. Banality of evil. That's an interesting one because that's a trope that's very realistic, but typically in fiction, people prefer to shy away from it. The gist of the banality of evil trope is that evil is boring and uncreative, which is true in real life. Most people who are doing evil things are doing them for very, very simple, cliched and played out reasons. But in fiction, evil is creative and heroism is banal, you know? Heroism is always coming from a simple place of like, oh, it's the right thing to do, or, oh, I must avenge my murdered dad or whatever. But like, in the real world, heroism comes from about 100 different places. Well, you know, increase that by a few orders of magnitude. And individual people can go to surprising lengths of compassion and kindness to the people they care about, whereas evil is uncreative and always looks the same. I think Ursula K. Le Guin has like an essay about this. The thing is, in fiction, people tend to do evil being interesting because it's more fun that way? I don't know. I mean, the thing is, most people work on the assumption that stories need to have conflict, and the way they interpret that is that stories need to have villains causing trouble. And if those villains causing trouble are as obligatory and banal in personality as they are in functional role in the plot, then the story isn't really all that interesting. Like, the villain is just there to be evil and cause problems, always in the same way, and that's not going to be fun. And, you know, it's just genuinely unpleasant to deal with both in real life and in fiction. So a lot of times in fiction, the villains will be providing new and exciting things for the heroes to oppose, whereas the heroes will be relatively constant things that don't change that much and always oppose evil for the same reasons. But in actuality, evil is stagnant, you know? Most people who are capable of growth and change are also capable of things like compassion and evolution and, you know, seeing their fellow humans as humans. And most people who are capable of the kinds of depths that we call evil are checked out from reality enough that it doesn't hurt them to be like that. And that usually means they're very... I've sometimes called it like they're calcified, like there are parts of them that should be flexible that they've just hardened so that they don't think about those things anymore. Like, it's very easy to be evil if you don't see other people as people, but that's hard for people. You have to train yourself to not see other people as people like you. Anyway, this could go on for a while, but at this point we're barely even talking about tropes anymore. Let's see. Trope Destiny. Is that particularly different than the trope on Chosen Ones I've actually done? The Trope Talk Badass and Child duo. I've definitely talked about that in other contexts. It's a form of mentors. It's a form of loners. Probably mostly based on Lone Wolf and Cub. The gist there is that you have a badass who's a real ass kicker, and you have a kid that they bring around with them. And sometimes people are like, it's pretty irresponsible of you to bring that kid with you. And they're like, whatever, man. This is us walking the road to hell together. That's the way it works in Lone Wolf and Cub. Usually this is used to make the badass more interesting and also less evil in general. I mean, the thing is, less evil. This is a person who's bringing a child with them when they do badass, potentially dangerous and scarring things. But the fact that they clearly care about the child is usually used as a sign that, like, see, they're not so bad. Look at that. They got a kid they're taking care of, kind of. Okay, we are, I'd say, last 5 minutes. Let me down just a smidge more tea. Time loops. Not quite as bad as the multiverse for demolishing the stakes, because normally they come with the implicit thing of, hey, we have to escape the time loop, which is a stake. Like, that's an actual goal for the heroes to pursue. But typically in a time loop, nothing really matters, or like things that... It's more like the space of things that matter is completely like shifted sideways from the space of things that normally matter in storytelling. So like, especially a time loop that resets when the person dies, it's like, well, congratulations, the number one threat that we normally use doesn't really exist anymore. So there are ways to write time loop stories that actually have stakes, especially if it's like you have to do the whole thing over again from the beginning if you mess up. like it's a really harsh roguelike video game. Let's see. I already complained about multiverses. Go back and watch the VOD when it's done. Let's see. Oh, I've been so good about not doing the tongue click thing, but here we are. Complete Monster. That's basically from the Pure Evil Trope Talk. There's a whole video about it. It's pretty good, I think. The Complete Monster trope is basically when you have a villain who has absolutely no redeeming qualities, just at all. They tend to be pretty flat because in order to make them have no redeeming qualities, that basically means that whenever they are given the opportunity to do something evil, they have to do it. Okay. Oh boy. I don't know. I've seen a few people be like, what about the Don't Fear the Reaper trope? And it's like, how is that that's a song and a concept that, you know, little memento mori, remember you will die, you know, don't fear the Reaper because it's an inevitability. That's not a trope, that's just a thing. I think you guys are maybe just like making stuff up at this point. What are my favorite tropes? Don't worry. There are or will be videos about them. Trope Talk Reincarnation. It's a major concept in several major religions around the world, and also sometimes people put it in fiction. It's not that complicated. Tomato in the Mirror kind of ties in with the clone stuff from earlier. You know, you think you're one thing, and then it turns out you're this completely different thing. For those of you who don't know and can't infer from the title, which is completely nonsensical, the Tomato in the Mirror thing is like the character sees themselves in the mirror and for the first time sees what they truly are. In this case, a tomato. You know, whatever. I'm sure it has a reason to be named that. It's been a while since I read that trope. But essentially, it's a character being alienated from themselves in some way. And like I mentioned, this ties in with the clone stuff because a lot of times the clone doesn't realize they're a clone. And when they find out they're a clone, it freaks them out. You know, they look in the mirror and they don't recognize who they see. So, non-binary aliens. It's a pretty common way to integrate some non-binary representation without having to actually examine the sense of binary genders in the context of humans. It's pretty easy to be like, oh, these aliens have no biological sex, and thus their gender is completely meaningless, so we can totally have non-binary they-them aliens. And then it's like, okay, what about a non-binary human? And they're like, well, how would that even work? Mentally, it's easier to come up with an entirely new thing than it is to change your mind about a thing you think you understand. So it's easier to do a non-binary alien than it is to do a non-binary human, which is probably why they're so popular. But we are seeing more of both, which is nice. You really want me to talk about the trope of bare your midriff, where sometimes people show their midriffs? Sometimes in costume design, people show their midriffs. The end. Ay. All right, we're gonna I'd say do one more trope. Oh boy, I shouldn't have said that. Evil twin, we can bring it full circle. That's basically what we started this talking about, although we were talking about clones and not twins. No, that's not fair. We were already talking about that one. Reluctant villains are interesting, depending on how they're done. A villain who doesn't really want to be a villain is also susceptible to this character is really stupid problem. It's not a guarantee, but a lot of those characters are very stupid. Because it's like, oh, I just have no choice but to turn to a life of crime and I can't possibly explain my grievances to anybody or get help. no, I have no choice but to fight Batman about it. And it's like, no, I feel like there were choices here. You know, basic human communication might have been able to solve this. So when you have a reluctant villain, like, you really need a good reason for them to be doing villainy and also being reluctant about it. And there are ways to do that. Sometimes you have characters that are like, hey, what's up? I really don't want to be evil, but I'm literally being coerced into it by a worse bad guy. And, like, if they can explain that, it's great. Sometimes they can't. And then it can actually be, like I said, like, it's cool when a character is smart and frustrating when a character is dumb. And that's a case where if a character figures that out without the character being able to tell them, that can be cool. That can be a cool, smart moment for the character. But again, it's all in the execution. Oh boy. All right. Yeah, well, we've creeped past the time I said, and I've done my final trope for the night. So I hope those of you that are watching Kenobi find it good. I probably won't watch it for a little while, but might be good. Oh boy. Sorry for the person who just woke up. We're about to end the stream, but the VOD will be available, and I'll probably add timestamps to it in the next day or so. So have fun with that. Oh god, not the Homestuck again. Every time, like, whenever I bring up a trope, there's like a 50-50 shot that someone will be like, oh, just like that thing they did of Act 3, Act 7, Act 1 of Homestuck. And it's like, oh yeah, I know what that is. It's definitely available to reread in an archive that's not completely busted. Anyway, thank you all so much for tuning in. I am astounded that we didn't dip below 2,500 viewers at any point once we got going, and we barely dipped below 3,000 for most of this. Like, of all the things that I could be doing, this is not the one that I expected to work this well. This is like more viewers than we sometimes get on game streams. So that's absolutely baffling. Anyway, yeah, I'm going to end this stream. I'm going to wait a few seconds. In my experience, if I end it when I want to end it, it'll just end it immediately and cut me off mid-sentence, which is pretty frustrating. So I'm going to, I guess, fill some dead air with some meaningless jargon, and then I'm going to go quiet, and then I'm going to end the stream. So thank you all so much for tuning in. As always, there will be a regular video coming out in slightly less than 10 hours, so look forward to that. And obviously we'll be back with, like, podcast stuff on Wednesday. So I'll talk to you guys later, and I'll probably put up some more, like, poll options for what these things could be, because I, as you know, can just sit here and talk about shows I like for 3 hours, but it helps to have a little bit of structure, you know, just a smidge, just a skosh. So I'm going to go drink the rest of this peppermint tea, and I will talk to you guys later. Gotta hit him with the "so yeah, you're so right" comment. All right, so yeah.